It's controversial to cover certain criminals, as some say it gives them the infamy they always wanted. On the other hand, the reasons why they do what they do may run much deeper than the pursuit of notoriety, and it's important to understand why to prevent their actions from repeating themselves. A very select few of these criminals have gone as far as to write entire documents trying to explain their motivations, and today we'll cover all of them. This is the Manifesto Killer Iceberg. I should also disclaim that we'll be delving into topics related to true crime, mental health, and radical ideologies, so if any of these are sensitive to you, then viewer discretion is advised. Additionally, this video is educational in nature. It has not been created to promote any of the actions and ideologies mentioned, simply to inform. Thank you. The Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race. You've probably heard these words in a meme or a passing critique of things like AI. But long before it became a catchphrase for general technology skepticism, it was embodied by a man. Born Theodore John Kaczynski in 1942 to a Polish-American family in Chicago, Ted's early childhood was marked by a very severe case of hives that led to him being separated from his parents by the pediatric hospital for a week. This event, along with Ted's dejected and depressed behavior once he was discharged, traumatized his mother to the point where she believes that that's where her son's psychological issues began. But he did improve and had a normal childhood, frequently camping with his father and brother and being generally fond of the outdoors. And him being in touch with nature would also be a running theme, as he had a pet parakeet he'd have perched on his shoulder even when taking family photos. According to pretty much anyone who knew him during childhood, he was healthy and well-adjusted, but soon after, they found he was much more than that. You see, up until 5th grade, Ted fit in with the other kids, but once he got an IQ test that revealed his IQ was 167, he skipped the 6th grade entirely and went right to the 7th, which eventually allowed him to graduate at just 15 years old. While this may sound good at face value, it resulted in Ted feeling left out and bullied by the other kids he shared classes with. It's at this point that Ted went from an active, healthy kid to an exceptionally smart but lonely teenager, aloof from his peers. During his brief but eventful time in school, Ted became extremely proficient at mathematics, being placed in advanced math classes and becoming one of his school's 5 national merit finalists, which fast-tracked his way into Harvard University. There, he spent 3 years getting a Bachelor of Arts degree in mathematics, but in his 2nd year, something unusual took place. Harvard psychologist Henry Murray was conducting a study where students were told they'd be debating philosophy with other students and had to prepare essays expounding on their beliefs. Then, instead of debating another student, an anonymous person would engage with the subject by exclusively demeaning their interests and beliefs to a verbally abusive degree, using the information from the essays as ammunition. Ted, under the subject name Lawful, was one of the 22 undergrads who took part, and he spent a total of 200 hours contributing to it, meaning he spent around 8 days straight just being harassed by a stranger for his thoughts for no real reason whatsoever. While Ted resented Murray for feeling that he'd violated his privacy by letting a random anonymous person read his essay, he didn't think this study had any long-lasting effects on his worldview and psyche. So, after he graduated Harvard, he applied to 3 other universities, all of which accepted him, but only one, the University of Michigan, offered him a teaching post and an additional annual grant of a little over $2,000, which would be worth $24,000 in today's money. While he did perform well during his time there, and pretty much every single faculty member that came in contact with him had only great things to say, he eventually described the 5 years he spent there as the worst 5 years of his life. And given he made that claim from inside of a prison, you can imagine how bad the university must have been. Regardless, his dissertation that year won a prize for the best dissertation of the year, and his director recognized his work as the best he'd ever done, despite acknowledging it was the kind of high-octane academic text that only a few people could even begin to appreciate. But one really odd detail about the time during which he was working on this dissertation is that over several weeks in 1966, Ted began having sexual fantasies of being a female, going as far as to decide to transition and schedule a meeting with a psychiatrist to take the first steps toward that goal. It wasn't until he actually got to the psychiatrist's waiting room that he reconsidered, at which point he became deeply enraged at the mere thought of following through on his fantasies. He proceeded to speak to the psychiatrist, but neglected to mention any of the thoughts that had been troubling his mind, pretending instead to be depressed over the prospect of being drafted into the military. He eventually channeled his rage for his experience here in his writings, saying, "As I walked away from the building afterwards, I felt disgusted about what my uncontrolled unsatiable cravings had almost led me to do, and I felt humiliated, and I violently hated the psychiatrist. Just then, there came a major turning point in my life. Like a phoenix, I burst from the ashes of my despair to a glorious new hope. I will kill, but I will make at least some effort to avoid detection so that I can kill again. These intentions to kill were first directed at the psychiatrists, and then to other people in his life whom he disliked. While he always enjoyed being close to nature over modern urban living, this is the first time where that preference escalated into a willingness to harm others, and it marks the beginning of his ultimate undoing. His professional career, despite being promising as he came closer and closer to being a tenured professor, suddenly came to an end when he resigned in 1969. While he left behind an impressive legacy as not only the youngest Harvard professor for the time, but also having most, if not all, of his conjectures about mathematics proven to be true. Over the next couple of years, Ted first moved back in with his parents, and then to a house in the middle of the Montana wilderness, with no electricity or even clean running water. His income came from performing random tasks for people who live nearby, but he needed very little in the first place, as the entire purpose of having moved out there was to become self-sufficient, to live off the land, to live off the grid. For the first few years of it, Ted lived peacefully, collecting books to continue his habit of studying. But this time it wasn't math, but instead sociology and political philosophy. But by 1975, his lifestyle took on a slightly more hostile nature, as Ted began setting up traps around his cabin to prevent invaders or outsiders in general from approaching it. One of the books he read happened to be The Technological Society by Jacques Ellul, and although that wasn't the intention of the author, it gave an articulate voice to Ted's lifelong skepticism of tech, setting him on a darker path. Eventually, in 1978, after plenty of experience jerry-rigging bizarre contraptions up around his house, Ted began carrying out his plan to strike out at the world that he'd come to see as moving forward too fast. And oddly, he picked Buckley Christ, a professor of materials engineering at Northwestern University, as his first victim. He did this by cleverly putting together an explosive package with a return address to Buckley and leaving it in a parking lot of another university. Fortunately, when it got to Buckley, he instantly recognized that he'd never mailed that package, and being suspicious that it could contain drugs, he had a campus police officer handle it instead, which, although it resulted in the detonation of the explosive inside, only caused a few very small, non-life-threatening injuries. Thus began the terrorist career of Ted Kaczynski, spanning the next 17 years, during which he targeted universities and airlines, hence the name Unabomber. His attacks resulted in the deaths of 3 people: computer store owner Hugh Scruton, advertising executive Thomas Mosser, and president of the California Forestry Association, Gilbert Brent Murray. But these are only the ones that actually passed away as a consequence of Ted's explosives, as many others were injured in a variety of ways. Besides these, there are other direct and indirect casualties of Ted's. Not only was he responsible for the deaths of some dogs he poisoned around the area where he lived, he came very close to killing a toddler that lived nearby. The only reason he held himself back from doing it was because he knew he'd have to kill the rest of her family as well in order to prevent himself from being caught. Despite the notoriety of his attacks, Ted somehow remained free, due to the way he put his bombs together, how careful he was when delivering them, and how distant from civilization he was. The FBI was having a very difficult time putting the pieces of the puzzle together and discovering who the Unabomber was. That is, until Ted finished writing his manifesto and mailed it to some newspaper publications. Sitting at a whopping 35,000 words in length, the manifesto, which is more akin to a full-on book, was titled Industrial Society and Its Future. In it, he enshrined technological development as the root of all evil. While the contents of it can get highly specific when detailing the process through which technological development negatively and irreversibly alters how societies arrange themselves, one thing that really jumps out of the text is that Ted suffers from intense tunnel vision when it comes to this topic. There's little in the way of an idea of what exactly the world is supposed to be like, nor is there any coherent idea of what a move away from technology would even be in the first place. I guess his lack of dedicated thought toward that aspect of his worldview is what led him to conclude that blowing up a few random people was the best way to attain his objectives. In the place of a vision of the outcome of the revolution he proposes, there is only the glorification of the wilderness as a concept. Ironically, the pursuit of the wilderness for its own sake is as bad as the pursuit of technology for its own sake, as neither of them are particularly concerned with the well-being and convenience of human beings. At some point, the most advanced forms of technology were sharp sticks and fire, and those stood between thriving primitive communities and getting mauled by wild animals. This is kind of the problem with Ted Kaczynski's analysis in general, because whenever he comes up with a halfway decent criticism of how the world is, such as his description of over-socialization, you have to weigh that against the fact that he wanted to shoot a toddler just because she she was near him. Another lowlight of his manifesto is his concept of the power process, which is so vague and arbitrary that it might as well have come from the time cube guy. All of this is without mentioning the fact that most, if not all of his ideas are borrowed and cobbled together from other modern thinkers, like the aforementioned Jacques Ellul, Sigmund Freud, and a few others. Lastly, it's also quite clear that Ted is almost exclusively familiar with modern psychology and philosophy, most of which comes from after the Industrial Revolution, which he rallies against relentlessly. This is quite ironic, since if he wanted to be diligent about his praise of the pre-industrial societies, he could have easily developed a much clearer image of what kind of world and people that kind of society produces. And he would have instantly learned that his vision didn't at all match that of pre-industrial philosophers. For example, Ted, a lifelong atheist, could never bring himself to adopt any religious beliefs, even if he felt tempted at times, especially during his time in the wilderness. His objection to it was that there was simply no scientific proof of there being a god, and in this, he had a lot more in common with the post-industrial man than with the people he aspired to be, in an ultimate sense. Pretty much every prominent person before the Industrial Revolution was engaging with religion in one way or another, but his undying respect for the scientific method and early modern creation stood in Ted's way up until the day he died. Characterizations of Ted as someone who yearned to be a genuine hunter-gatherer or medieval peasant all fall short, since, despite his many objections to it, he was a product of the modern world through and through. He didn't leave society to live the life his ancestors would have lived in some tribal community. As a matter of fact, he didn't even go far enough to prevent people from just accidentally finding their way to his cabin. He left society with the full intent of continuing to engage with it, although this time in a hostile and destructive way, as an atomized individual putting together fairly technologically sophisticated weapons. Bombs. As pointed as his manifesto was, it fell flat and shallow, as its contents were chronically overshadowed by, well, the fact that he was blowing random people up via the mail. But I should say, there was one great thing that came from the publication of his manifesto, and that was his capture. At the beginning of this entry, I mentioned that Ted had a younger brother, but only now does he come back into play. While Ted's mind decayed and his life spiraled apart, his brother David had a similar path, quitting his career as a school teacher to just live off the land for a few years. But unlike Ted, after 15 years of living in a cabin on a remote plot of land in Texas, when David's father passed away, he returned to society and embraced a normal life, which included rekindling his relationship with and eventually marrying his high school girlfriend, Linda. 5 years later, after the publication of Ted's manifesto, Linda read it and immediately suspected that Ted was the one behind it. When she told David of her suspicion, David also perused the text and felt the same way. At the time, the FBI was at an all-time high alert, and they were so desperate for tips that they were offering $1 million for anyone who could help them catch the Unabomber. But of the thousands of tips they received, only one panned out: David's, who led them directly to Ted's cabin in Montana, where he was promptly arrested. In his cabin, they found bomb components, 40,000 pages of Ted's journals, and a bunch of firearms and bombs. Following his capture, there was extensive discussion as to whether Ted was insane or not, but ultimately, the trial concluded in Ted pleading guilty to all charges and receiving a life sentence. During his time in prison, he not only continued to hold his anti-technology views, but also produced many new writings, although they mostly echoed his manifesto and added very little in the way of new ideas. He also befriended two other terrorists that he was imprisoned with, namely Timothy McVeigh, who blew up a federal building, killing nearly 200 and injuring another 700, and Ramzi Youssef, an Islamic terrorist whose innumerable acts of terrorism, including the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center, are speculated to be responsible for the deaths of up to 30-something people and the injuries of over 1,000. After spending over 2 decades in prison, in 2021, Ted was diagnosed with rectal cancer, and after 2 years of consistently showing signs of depression, went out the same way his father did, taking his own life as a consequence of his poor cancer prognosis. Despite how tragic and catastrophic Ted's life turned out to be, he remains a person of interest in the cultural landscape to this day, with some people going as far as to show sympathy for his motivations and deeds. And obviously his writings and work, if you want to call it that, have also inspired a lot of pretty good memes. Very few criminals have ever attained the same degree of notoriety as Eric Harris and Dylann Klebold, two high schoolers from Colorado who decided, for barely any justification besides their hatred for the world itself, to conduct an attack of unforeseen proportions on their high school. Darker still is the fact that they originally planned for bombings to have taken place that would have overshadowed whatever they managed to do with their firearms. But fortunately, they never developed the degree of expertise necessary to carry out that kind of thing. While many myths arose in the wake of their crime about how how their deeds had something to do with bullying or social exclusion, the diary entries they wrote while in the lead up to the massacre served to clear it up, as both boys were pretty articulate as to why they thought they needed to do what they did. First, let's go over Eric's diary, which immediately starts out with a now completely redacted list of students, which Eric subtitled with the words, "Class of 98, top of the should have died list." This grim introduction is immediately followed by, "I hate the world. Too many goddamn in it. Too many thoughts and different societies all wrapped up together in this place called America. Everyone has their own opinions on everything. And you may be saying, well, what makes you so different? Because I have something only me and Dylan have. Self-awareness. We know what we are to this world and what everyone else is. We have been watching you people. We know what you think and how you act. Everything is so corrupt and filled with opinions and points of view and people's own little agendas and schedules. This isn't a world anymore. It's hell on earth and no one knows it." He sees himself as having a higher awareness than anyone in his surroundings, to the point where he claims he knows how they think and act, but at the same time, he expresses frustration about how many opinions and points of view there are. Being above something generally means that it doesn't affect you, but his frustration seems to stem from the fact that, despite his claimed superiority, he has absolutely no control, no power over all of his perceived underlings. Immediately after, he once again alters his stance by complaining instead about how robotic people are and how everyone is a follower. To put it bluntly, there's barely any rhyme or reason to Eric's hatred for the world. With this kind of thing in mind, whatever deeper philosophical motivations anyone's ever ascribed to Eric amounts to little more than a rationalization. As a matter of fact, the things he's saying here are also rationalizations. Later on, when they got to recording their tapes, which I've actually covered in another video on my channel, titled Homemade Videos with Disturbing Backstories, Eric bragged about how much he liked deceiving others, tricking them into thinking he was a nice guy. In his diary, he elaborated on this particular topic, saying, "I lie a lot, almost constant, and to everybody, just to keep my own ass out of the water. And by the way, I don't think I'm doing this for attention, as some people may think. Let's see, what are some big lies I've told? Yeah, I stopped smoking. I feel bad for doing it, not for getting caught. No, I haven't been making more bombs. No, I wouldn't do that. And of course, countless other ones. And yeah, I know I hate liars and I am one myself. Oh well. It's okay if I'm a hypocrite, but no one else. Because I am higher than you people. No matter what you say, if you disagree, I would shoot you. This is one of the most telling traits of someone who either has or is developing strong tendencies towards sadistic and psychopathic behavior. And like every sadist and psychopath, Eric drastically overestimated his ability to deceive. As almost exactly 2 years before the attack took place, Eric's father had taken notice of his erratic, violent, and otherwise inappropriate behavior and started keeping track of it in a log. Other people around Eric, including his friends, had also picked up on his violent outbursts, but none of them realized the extent of his issue. Throughout his diary, which was written over the course of around a year, Eric came up with a plethora of explanations for his philosophy of the world, but the themes remained consistent. He expressed feeling like he was God, like he was the physical manifestation of concepts like universal intelligence, natural selection, math, and science, but not once does he attach these feelings to anything besides his willingness to break what he considered to be arbitrary laws that constrained the human race. It's like the mere idea of not being allowed to do something, or being expected not to, was insulting, and consequently, breaking these expectations and norms was attractive as a means of demonstrating his superiority. Based on his comments about how all morality is man-made and relative, it's almost as if he induced ego death and derealization through sheer sadistic impulse. Regardless of what psychopaths and sadists come up with as far as explanations for their behavior, the reality is always that they simply get joy out of predating on those who are vulnerable to them, committing every crime of opportunity they possibly can. And if you are weak or dumb enough to be targeted by them, then you deserve it. It's a power trip generated by someone who, for one reason or another, resents their own weakness. In late 1998, Eric wrote, "Everyone is always making fun of me because of how I look, how weak I am. Well, I will get you all back. Ultimate revenge here. You people could have shown more respect, treated me better, asked for my knowledge or guidance more, treated me more like a senior, and maybe I wouldn't have been as ready to tear your heads off. Then again, I've always hated how I looked. I make fun of people who look like me, sometimes without even thinking, sometimes just because I want to rip on myself. That's where a lot of my hate grows from, the fact that I have practically no self-esteem, especially concerning girls and looks and such. Therefore, people make fun of me constantly. Therefore, I get no respect, and therefore, I get pissed." If all of this is coming off as petty, it's because that's what it is. Between his fantasies of violent revenge, there was only the odd admission to hating himself and more fantasies, this time of girls from his class that he desperately wanted to be with, but couldn't. He can talk about how much he liked philosophers like Hobbes and Nietzsche, and how his writings have deeper meanings, but underneath the surface of pretense, there's was just a drive to satisfy himself and his pride, and nothing else. Later on, it becomes even clearer that the people who excluded Eric for being weird weren't being unfair and bullying him, they were just picking up on the fact that he was a hostile, compulsive liar who was interested in nothing besides himself and his thoughts, the only thing he truly prized. Dylan, on the other hand, was a bit of a different story. Unlike Eric's rapacious cover page listing the people who should die, Dylan's cover page is strangely childish in nature. At the top, he wrote, "Fact. People are so unaware. Well, ignorance is bliss, I guess. That would explain my depression," followed by a quotation mark listing himself as the author of the quote. Underneath, there was a drawing of a book that was subtitled, "This book cannot be opened by anyone except Dylan." Parentheses, some supernatural force blocks common people from entering. The next page has a few crude drawings and a diagram depicting a tiered distribution of existence, and completely outside of it is a square labeled me, which is essentially Eric claiming the status of the ultimate outcast. It's only when we get to the first page of actual writing that we get a much more transparent display of personality, especially when contrasted with Eric, who seemed to be posturing even when writing in his diary. Dylan starts out by laying out all aspects of his life that cross his mind, almost as if he were sitting outside of it altogether. But eventually, he circles his way to the point. He sees death, namely his own, as a means of escaping his reality, which, in his eyes, is composed of monotony, cycles of mild suffering punctuated by completely meaningless tasks. There's no anger here, just melancholy. Unlike Eric, who eventually got to existential questions to justify his hatred for other people, Dylan's primary struggle is existential, and because of it, he eventually comes to the conclusion that death is the only way out, although he only talks about his own, not that of other people. He occasionally says similar things to Eric, claiming to be a god, but it seems a lot more contrived than Eric's musings. With Dylan, it's less about placing himself above people, and more about placing himself outside of society, not out of sheer superiority, but instead from feeling alien to his surroundings and his peers. Interestingly enough, on the following page, he refers to someone else besides Eric as his best friend, but proceeds to lament that this person no longer spent any time with him after getting a girlfriend. Ironically enough, this is soon followed by Dylan himself claiming to have found his true soulmate in a girl from school, who he describes as his first love. However normal this passage is in and of itself, this brief honeymoon period he had with this girl he wasn't even dating quickly came to an abrupt end, as the next entry in his diary reads, "Oh God, I want to die so bad. Such a sad, desolate, lonely, unsalvageable I feel I am. Not fair, not fair. I wanted happiness. I never got it. Let's sum up my life. It is the most miserable existence in the history of time. My best friend has ditched me forever, lost and bettering himself, and having/enjoying/taking for granted his love. They look at me like I'm a stranger. I helped them both out through life, and they left me in the abyss of suffering that I boosted them out of. The one whom I thought was my true love is not, just a shell of what I want the most. The meanest trick was played on me, a fake love. She, in reality, doesn't care about me, doesn't even know me. I have no happiness, no ambitions, no friends, and no love. Redacted can get me that gun, I hope. I want to use it on a poor SOB I know. His name is Dylan. What else can I do or give? I stopped watching adult films. I try not to pick on people. I've always been hated by everyone and everything, just never aware. Goodbye, all the crushes I've ever had. Just shells, images, no truths. But why? A dark time. Infinite sadness. I want to find love." In the end, he breaks into a bit of a haiku, and the next page is nothing but bad teenage poetry. If we weren't talking about Dylan Klebold here, you could almost think that the person who wrote it eventually just grew out of it, rendering the diary nothing but a cringeworthy artifact of their troubled teen years. Unfortunately, they reflected something much darker. Unlike Eric, who only ever mentioned girls as the objects of animal-esque desire, Dylan genuinely craved affection from girls in a very conventional incel kind of way, feeling sorry for himself and constantly claiming that he had no shot at life and everyone hated him, despite his life being pretty decent all things considered. He only expressed an interest in hurting others when he became particularly despondent, but even then, he didn't really depict it as a kind of deserved revenge, and more so as something he'd do out of how little meaning he sees in life. I won't go into painstaking detail since Dylan repeatedly loops between aggressively groveling about how sad his love life is to convincing himself that he's living in a romantic movie. At times, it can even get extremely embarrassing, such as when Dylan grieves over the fact that he can't stop himself from watching adult movies centered around bondage and feet, and proceeds to apologize to one of his pseudo-girlfriends. It's especially grating when the journal suddenly pivots from the sappy, angsty teenage love stuff to the specifics of planning their attack on the high school, down to how they would dress while doing it. As many people have speculated, Dylan appeared intellectually disengaged with the idea of a shooting, only writing things down if they were related to the logistics of it, as if it were just a task, like any other task. It's quite likely that if it weren't for Eric actively spurring him to do it, Dylan wouldn't even have come close to an act of violence loss of that magnitude. While I've already gone more in depth in my aforementioned video about disturbing homemade videos, it's also worth mentioning that right before they began their attack, Dylann and Eric recorded one last goodbye to their families. While Dylann apologizes to his mom and explains he'll be happier wherever he goes after he dies as a consequence of what he's about to do, Eric says that he can't help it. They both say sorry and goodbye, and the tape comes to an end. While their musings about their crime can technically qualify as manifestos, they're not very effective at that, as it seems they were often lost as to why they were doing what they did in the first place. Of course, what followed was one of the most infamous crimes of all time, as Eric and Dylann took the lives of 16 at Columbine High, including their own, and indirectly, one of their victims who died decades later due to complications related to the injuries suffered during the shooting. Anders Breivik is the second deadliest right-wing terrorist ever, second only to Timothy McVeigh, who blew up an entire building. There's really no overstating how gruesome and murderous of an incident this was. But before we can get into that, we have to characterize who Anders was as a person. Fathered by Jens Breivik, a now retired Norwegian foreign affairs diplomat who worked directly with the Iranian capital of Tehran, it's starkly ironic that Anders himself eventually developed specifically anti-Muslim views. But I should say, Anders wasn't raised by Jens. Instead, he was raised by his mother, Wenche Bering, a woman with a particularly troubled upbringing. Wenche's mother suffered from polio around the same time she was born, which led to her being sent to an orphanage and eventually finding her way back to her father, with whom she had a good life. This once again changed radically when her father passed away, sending Wenche back to live with her mother, who at this point was wheelchair-bound and suffered from intense paranoia and hallucinations, often blaming Wenche for the paralysis. When she turned 17, she fled her household and had a child, Elizabeth, Anders' older maternal sister. It's only many years after that she met Jens Breivik and became pregnant with Anders. And before he was even born, she already had developed a hatred for her own son, imagining that he, an infant still in her womb, was purposely tormenting her and putting her through pain. Clearly, Wenche was continuing the cycle of abuse and paranoia. After having him, she quickly stopped breastfeeding Anders, saying that he was sucking the life out of her. And soon after, she separated from Jens, making it so that it was just her and Anders. Obviously, this is a recipe for disaster. During his early childhood, Wenche refused to check in on Anders and his sister through the night, and despite being just 6 years old, his sister did her best to take care of him. As a result, Anders developed a bit of an affective dysfunction. He became aloof, smiling, almost as if compulsively, seemingly careless and unaffected by his mother's many forms of abuse. At the same time, he was very clingy and required a lot of his mother's affection, eventually sleeping in her bed with her every night. In an attempt to peel him off of her, Wenche filed for respite care and successfully matched Anders with a couple of foster parents, although she eventually put an end to this arrangement herself, probably to continue engaging in her bizarre relationship with her son. One particularly dark red flag is that when bringing Anders over to the foster couple's house, Wenche suggested that Anders be allowed to touch his foster father's private parts, and her reasoning for that was that he had never seen someone like himself, which is obviously extremely twisted. Later on, as Wenche continued to seek out ways to manage what she perceived as her son's problems, she got in contact with family therapists and psychiatrists due to him allegedly being too clingy and hyperactive. The therapist promptly deduced that the source of this was the family's issues and decided to place him temporarily in a toy room to see if he would fare better. Instead of the expected outcome, Anders became despondent, whereas other kids became ecstatic. He wasn't interested in the toys or the other kids, and had a very tough time expressing his emotions. As they followed up on Anders' case, the SSBU, which is the board of therapists that was responsible for Anders' care, concluded that his mother was a borderline case, which explained her flipping between complete indifference to her son and a complete obsession to the point of wishing death upon him or even placing him in sexual contexts, which is especially disturbing. Seeing how dire their situation was, and how much it had already affected Anders, to the point where he was unable to cry even when hurt and couldn't make friends, they settled on having Anders taken care of by another set of foster parents on weekends, to ensure he was at least exposed to a healthier familial situation on a weekly basis. Eventually, after Anders' father, Jens, intervened and requested his custody, Wenche became defensive, to the point of refusing not just to give Jens custody, but also to prevent Anders from seeing his foster parents. This was particularly tragic since Anders was finally showing signs of improvement and was allegedly exhibiting much better behavior in the nursery he attended. In response, the SSBU did everything in their power to take Anders away from Wenche, but unfortunately, it was to no avail. The supervision the family was under only lasted for 3 weeks, after which Anders was fully subject to his mother's father's treatment of him, and undoubtedly, this contributed to his disturbed mental state. Despite that, however, Anders seemed to be unusually functional, being described as smarter and physically stronger than his peers, and not only getting along with them, but actively protecting the ones who couldn't protect themselves from bullying. Additionally, a few correlated claims, including those made by Anders himself, depict him as also being on good terms with all of his family members, his mom's new husband, all 5 of his half-siblings, and even his estranged dad and his new wife, although they fell out of touch when Anders was developing an interest in graffiti from ages 13 through 16. Even in this case, Anders remarks that his father didn't just choose to cut contact with him, but also with his 4 other children, meaning it wasn't Anders' intention to fall out of touch with his father. Ultimately, Anders claims that, despite the hang-ups with his mother, he didn't really have any traumatic or negative experiences during his childhood. However dubious this is as a claim, especially considering what he would go on to do, his older sister, Elizabeth, who was also under the care of Wenka, ended up getting married and moving to America, living a healthy and perfectly normal life. This is a good time to highlight that, despite whatever dysfunction someone grows up with, doing the kind of thing that Anders did is a choice, and not an inevitable consequence of trauma or anything like that. But unfortunately, Anders did not follow in his sister's footsteps. As I mentioned previously, during his teenage years, Anders developed an interest in graffiti, and to some extent, hip-hop culture in general. He had such a strong devotion to it that he was caught by cops on 2 different occasions, although it only ever resulted in a couple of fines. Once he eventually grew out of this interest, he instead took up weightlifting, which was immediately followed by steroid abuse due to being fixated on looking big and strong, not just to get girls' attention, but also for himself. His obsession with his appearance extended to eventually getting a few plastic surgeries on his forehead, nose, and chin. But for all intents and purposes, while Anders was odd, he showed no signs of being particularly sadistic or evil. When he was 21, he worked as a customer service person at a company, and his coworkers from that time period describe him as being patient and kind to everyone, regardless of what kind of person they were. But it's worth noting that even this early on, he already showed an interest in far-right politics, becoming a member of an anti-immigration youth group of the Norwegian Progress Party, and eventually running for municipal office, but losing. Past that point, he would remain active in more conventional political movements well into the late 2000s, but it seems he slowly lost faith in fixing things through that medium. During this period, where he not only retained a semblance of normalcy, but often found himself as a leader figure, he traveled the world, once to Belarus to visit a girlfriend, to the United States a few times to get the cosmetic surgeries that I mentioned earlier, and to 22 other countries in total. Lastly, Breivik became a member of the Oslo Pistol Club, owning 2 registered firearms, and he also joined his local Masonic lodge. Financially, he was well-to-do, and on the surface, nothing suggested that he was even considering doing anything of the nature and proportion as he eventually did. But underneath the surface, a very different picture begins to unravel. While he claims to have been exempted from military service because he needed to take care of his sick mother, there's some conflicting information on the topic, suggesting instead that he was deemed unfit. Online, he frequented several anti-immigration and right-wing forums, but even here, he refrained from making overt threats or really outlining his intentions. In the one single post he ever made to Twitter, he ominously quoted John Stuart Mill, saying, "One person with a belief is equal to the force of 100,000 who only have interests." It was this kind of inkling of his intentions that he left behind, only shadowy suggestions as to what was really on his mind. In the early to mid-2000s, he started a computer programming business while still working in customer service, and he claims that the company grew to eventually have 6 employees and several offshore bank accounts. But there's a lot of conflicting information surrounding this aspect of the story. According to him, he got up to millions of Norwegian krona, lost a couple $1,000,000 on the stock market, but did manage to keep a couple million for his own personal use. While that sounds like a whole lot of money, the krona is worth a lot less than the dollar, so at most, he was left with $250,000 American dollars. But that's still a decent amount of money. On the other hand, as far as public records go, while he did have an IT company in the mid-2000s, it committed multiple violations of the law, mostly related to accounting and taxation. So eventually, it went bankrupt, and he was left not with a couple million krona, but instead just over 600,000, which is around 75,000 US dollars. Despite this being a much smaller amount than what he claimed to have had, it clearly was enough for him to start another business, Breivik Geofarm, records of which are up on the internet to this day. With this shell company set up, he began ordering tons of fertilizer to make explosives with. Lastly, he started going through what little money he had left to move out to a rural, unpopulated area in Norway, presumably so that he could go about his business without anyone nearby to see him test explosives or practice shooting. A very far cry from the likable, though aloof person he once was, Anders quietly stepped out of society to prepare for what would become one of the most horrific mass shootings ever perpetrated. At this point, he'd begun to nourish his own delusions of being a modern-day member of the Knights Templar, which was a military religious order that operated during the Crusades, and mainly dealt in wars against neighboring Islamic empires and their strongholds in Europe. His manifesto, as a matter of fact, is emblazoned with the Templar's cross right on the cover. And it's also worth noting that the Freemasons, which as I mentioned earlier, he was a member of, actively fashioned themselves with inspiration from the Knights Templar, not just in their shared mythology, but also down to having a subgroup that is literally named Knights Templar. Whether this in particular was of great significance to Anders, or if it's just a quick and easy tie-in to his already held beliefs, it's kind of impossible to say. What we do know is that for the 2 years following the creation of his farming business, Anders settled himself away from civilization. Eventually, back in Oslo, on the 22nd of July 2011, at about 3 p.m. in the afternoon, a van parked right by the tower block that housed the then Prime Minister of Norway, Jens Stoltenberg. A man got out of the van and walked away, and soon after, everyone in the vicinity heard an explosion so great that it was picked up by audio surveillance technology. As a consequence, 8 people died and another 200 were injured due to the damage caused to the building. The police were immediately on high alert, but it wasn't enough to stop Breivik's next move. Within 2 hours of the car bomb, he made his way to a youth summer camp organized by the Norwegian Labour Party, put on a fake police officer suit, entered the premises of the camp, and then proceeded to open fire on everyone in sight. In a little over an hour, Anders took the lives of 69 people and injured another 32. Ultimately, Breivik's death toll that day was almost 80 people, and surprisingly, when the police showed up to arrest him, he instantly surrendered without resisting. As they took him into custody, he explained to the cops that he did what he did because he thought that the Labour Party had betrayed Norway. But unsurprisingly, the cops weren't impressed with this explanation, and it certainly did nothing to justify all of the innocent people he killed, many of whom were teenagers, as he specifically targeted a youth group. While they apprehended his weapons, they realized that he had carved Nordic runes into his firearms, and later on, during their investigation of his equipment, they also found that his helmet, which he ultimately didn't use due to how inconvenient and heavy it was purchased from an Israeli website. Of course, these facts sort of flew in the face of his crusader shtick, but it's hardly surprising coming from someone as insane and delusional as he was. Just as he was processed to face trial and the fallout of his crimes reached peak notoriety, hitting international news, the cops who went to his house discovered that one of his last acts of preparation for the attack was mailing a 1,500-page manifesto to over 1,000 different email addresses. Due to the sheer volume of people who received it, it wasn't even possible to try and prevent the text from being made public. And although the majority of it has Anders going over standard right-wing extremist rhetoric, some bits do stand out. For example, he wrote, "I don't hate Muslims at all. I acknowledge there are magnificent Muslim individuals in Europe. In fact, I have had several Muslim friends over the years, some of whom I still respect. That does not mean, however, that I will accept an Islamic presence in Europe. Muslim individuals who do not assimilate 100% within 2020 will be deported as soon as we manage to seize power." The "we" part of his statement reads as a bit strange, as not only did he fail to get himself elected as a mayor 10 years prior, but even during his time dwelling in online extremist forums, he wasn't too successful in rallying other people's support for his vision. After looking through a lot of his manifesto, if any pathology can be ascribed to Anders, it's pure delusion. In another passage, he talks about forming a modern vision of the Knights Templar order with Serbian conservatives, but there doesn't seem to be any evidence of this happening whatsoever. Interestingly enough, his delusion didn't extend to his own brutality, as he was quite aware that what he was doing was monstrous. In other parts of his manifesto, he wrote, "If you are unwilling or incapable of killing women due to the principles of chivalry, you should probably steer away completely from the armed resistance movements and should probably consider creating yet another right-wing blog instead. Do not apologize, make excuses, or express regret, for you are acting in self-defense. Some innocents will die in our operations, as they are simply at the wrong place at the wrong time. Get used to the idea. The needs of the many will always surpass the needs of the few." This little phrase he says at the end here is the bread and butter of every totalitarian ideology, the justification for any act whatsoever. The ends justify the means. But despite the occasional transparent look into the inner workings of Anders' mind, the crushing majority of his manifesto is just him elaborating on his vision of history in minute detail. Although his trial did receive a lot of global scrutiny and pressure, it would be kind of wrong to call it controversial, as this case was about as clear-cut as you could possibly get. In interviews he gave during his stay in jail, he himself further elaborated on what led him to commit his crimes, not denying anything. According to his retelling, he had a Muslim friend during his time as a graffiti artist who celebrated whenever Americans suffered losses during the Gulf War. And at the time, although he had no idea why his friend reacted that way, it inspired him to develop an interest in geopolitics, which eventually grew to become an interest in his national identity as a Norwegian. He also talked about being close closely associated with 2 Muslim Pakistani gangs who collected jizya, a kind of punitive tax for people they considered infidels or outsiders from the locals in their area who weren't a part of their gang. Besides that, these gangs also beat, harassed, and did even worse to the Norwegian locals, whom they called potatoes as an ethnic slur against them. Still, he never even considered becoming a part of a racist gang, not because he was opposed to their ideology per se, but instead because he knew the skinheads were into metal music and goth girls, both of which he disliked so much that it fundamentally prevented him from befriending them. Despite sympathizing with their ideals, he continued to associate with the Muslim Pakistani gangs, even though he knew they were responsible for the rape of 2 girls he personally knew. Obviously, none of the egregious things he describes being done by these gang members justifies his killing of innocent people, but it's shocking to see how much he was willing to look the other way during his teenage years. This kind of blunted, disengaged affect is the same he exhibits when talking about his own crimes, as if he can't even recognize what he did, at one point even saying that he would do it all over again, given the opportunity. Of course, he eventually changed his tune, and claimed he dissociated from acts of violence and the objectives he laid out in his manifesto in an attempt to get released on parole. Also, during his jail interview, he maintained that he was a justiciar knight and a representative of Catholic Europe, although I'm pretty sure that if you're Catholic, you're not allowed to support eugenics, be a Freemason, or, commit mass murder. He went through a few psychological evaluations, although they had a very hard time providing an exact diagnosis of just what was wrong with him, fluctuating between describing him as homicidal, psychotic, paranoid schizophrenic, narcissistic, and a laundry list of other terms. In the meantime, he pled not guilty, but when he was convicted of his crimes and received his sentence, he didn't appeal it, as he considered an appeal a legitimization of the results of his trial. While in prison, most of which he spent in what was essentially solitary confinement, he abandoned Christianity altogether and adopted Odinism, which coincided with him throwing up Roman salutes while entering his court hearings. By the way, he was doing all of this while claiming he was no longer a danger to society and deserved probation. Since his conviction, he's tried a bunch of different times to sue the government of Norway to either get parole or improve his prison conditions on the grounds of human rights, going as far as to claim he'd been thinking about taking his own life. These attempts have not been fruitful, and Norway has kept him in mostly solitary confinement, which is probably a good move since he repeatedly fluctuates between promising to be peaceful before immediately entrenching himself even deeper in his ideology and delusions. While the previous 3 entries were entirely offline phenomena, the same cannot be said for the supreme gentleman himself. Elliot Rodger can be said to be the ultimate manifestation of the word incel, having fulfilled it to the utmost extent. Rodger had a few traumatic, even if mundane, events take place during his formative years. For one, his parents divorced when he was 7, which he described as devastating and life-changing, which, in all fairness, it really can be for some kids. It must have been especially jarring for Elliot, who clearly had some developmental issues, preferring to write things down due to having a very tough time speaking to others. He would even cry in crowds due to being overstimulated. While his mother described him as a high-functioning autistic child, one of the psychiatrists he went to suggested instead that he possibly had depression or anxiety. Whatever the case was, he was extremely insecure about being short, about being half Asian, and pretty much anything that set him apart from other people. Any aspect of his identity that he perceived as flawed was immediately blamed for any aspect of his life that he perceived as negative. It's important to add these caveats because, obviously, being short or half Asian aren't flaws, nor was his life particularly bad. From what we know, he didn't even receive a lot of bullying as a child, but his feelings chronically failed to reflect reality. He was clearly capable of making friends despite his issues, but keeping those friends was the real challenge, as his paradoxical feelings of worthlessness and superiority always got in the way, whether directly or indirectly. As he approached puberty, he distanced himself from society, delving into video games like World of Warcraft and being much too online for his own good. This led him to be shown images of naked girls by a friend of his, which he found simultaneously mesmerizing and traumatizing, which isn't all that crazy given he was just 11 years old when it happened. This feeling was later rekindled when he randomly saw some teenager watching adult videos at a cafe, which ended up bringing Elliot to tears due to how unbearably intense it was for him. It became a consistent source of stress for Elliot. The mere sight of attractive girls, socially active men, and especially those two combined, was sufficient enough to destroy destroy his day and send his mental health careening off the deep end. He changed schools a few times, but no matter where he went, he somehow always found himself being the victim of bullying. Now, kids can be really terrible sometimes, but it's worth noting that most of this information came from Elliot himself. And to say that Elliot was biased towards seeing himself as a hapless victim is an understatement. It could very well be that these incidents of bullying weren't as bad as he described them, or that they were the result of some instigation from him in the first place. But the fact remains, he was an outcast. In high school, he finally got a formal diagnosis. But even then, it was somewhat uncertain since he didn't score high enough to be deemed autistic, being labeled instead as having an unspecified pervasive developmental disorder. By age 15, he was put on Xanax and Prozac, as well as the occasional Paxil, although he wasn't very disciplined about the consistency with which he took his medication, as he said that it made him drowsy and tired. Despite being medicated, his demeanor didn't change too much, and by the time he turned 18 and graduated, he had stopped taking all of his meds altogether. Soon after he graduated from high school, he bounced between a few different colleges, repeatedly dropping out due to the anxiety he got from seeing couples and from generally being socially inept. Eventually, he ended up being sent to UCSB in Isla Vista, where he would eventually commit his grisly crimes. It's here that his dysfunction takes another significant turn for the worse, as he began frequently fantasizing about exacting revenge on society for his situation. He describes himself coming to the realization that he wouldn't hesitate to act out his sadistic and violent urges against the people he deemed deserving of it, and frequently imagined himself barging into a room while a couple was having intercourse so that he could kill them. He shared inklings of his thoughts with his closest friends, some of whom were also virgins and outcasts themselves. But of course, none of them sympathized with his worldview, and one by one, he lost contact with them all. As he slowly but surely abandoned society, he began working up to his acts of violence. First with small things, like throwing coffee cups at couples and filling super soakers up with orange juice to spray people playing kickball. Eventually, he settled on what he would come to call his day of retribution, where he would commit one massive act of violence against the world. But before he could do that, he decided to try as hard as he could to get laid, although his methods of doing so were childish and nonsensical. He went to a few parties, but didn't talk to anyone, and in one instance, he got mad at a group of girls for not approaching him and decided to push them off a window ledge. When he ultimately failed to successfully push them off the ledge, he was the one to be pushed off, breaking his ankle, and he was then promptly beaten by the other people at the party. While this did delay the day of retribution, it only served to strengthen his resolve that he needed to do it. His psychiatrist, likely sensing that something was wrong, prescribed him with the antipsychotic risperidone, but Elliot refused to take it even once. Briefly, he even considered killing his stepmother and his 6-year-old half-brother, but eventually decided not to, opting instead to target his fellow students. Over the course of a year, Elliot came to own 3 different firearms, and although he also had 3 different run-ins with the cops, they never found out that he had any guns. In preparation, he began recording and posting a series of YouTube videos expounding on his worldview, as well as writing his autobiographical manifesto, which was ultimately titled My Twisted World: The Story of Elliot Rodger. Over nearly 140 pages, Elliot retells every single negative experience and slight he had ever suffered in his life, as a final testament to his worldview. The notion that the fundamental problem with everything is that women arbitrarily deny some men sexual release while giving it instead to the undeserving. Unsurprisingly, he doesn't mind stretching the truth and rapidly recontextualizing every situation to make his argument. At this point, there was no going back, and after having one last meal with a few of his family members, on the 23rd of May, Elliot began his spree. He proceeded to stab 3 of his roommates to death, and after getting himself a triple vanilla latte at the local Starbucks, he wrote down one last message in his journal, which read, "I had to tear some pages out because I feared my intentions would be discovered. I taped them back together as fast as I could. This is it. In 1 hour, I will have my revenge on this cruel world. I hate you all. Die." After this, he got in his car and recorded one last YouTube video titled Retribution, wherein he infamously called himself the Supreme Gentleman and explained his basic reasoning for his acts, while repeatedly letting out fake laughs for dramatic effect. He posted the video, emailed his manifesto to 34 people, and immediately drove to a nearby sorority house, where he fatally shot 3 girls and injured another. As bystanders ran to their rescue and called the cops, Rodger got back in his car and continued to drive, and in the process of doing this, he shot another 2 people and hit another 7 before he crashed into a parked car and took his own life via gunshot. A dark ending to a sad and seemingly pointless tragedy. Christopher Jordan Dorner, although he was born in New York, was actually raised in California to a family composed exclusively of women, his single mom and his sister. Whatever the situation truly was with his dad, and despite the lack of information surrounding his early life, it does seem like Dorner grew up without a father figure present. Regardless, he was forced by his surroundings to really toughen up, as if the manifesto he eventually wrote is worthy of our trust, he was the only black student from 1st to 7th grade and was the target of a lot of students' name-calling as a consequence. While it's likely that some degree of harassment did in fact happen because of his race, the degree itself is still in question, as we'll later see that Dorner can be quite paranoid and delusional when it comes to this particular topic. But for the time being, whatever issues that Christopher did suffer didn't get in the way of his development, as he not only played on his school's football team, but he also signed up for a youth program, in which he could receive training to eventually become a member of the LAPD. Once he graduated from high school, he immediately enrolled in college, where he continued to play football while getting a Bachelor of Science degree in political science and a minor in psychology. While he recalls suffering 2 concussions during his time playing football, nothing majorly traumatic came as a consequence, as CT scans suggested he was fine. After breezing through school, Chris decided to join the Navy, and while he was still an ensign, the lowest entry-level rank, he made the news for returning nearly $8,000 that had been lost by a nearby Korean church. This display of integrity and honor on his part was just the first of many, as his career in the Navy was a stellar one to say the least. He was deployed multiple times from 2002 to 2013, achieved the rank of lieutenant, and got a bunch of medals before he was honorably discharged. But unfortunately, it seems the rest of his life wasn't nearly as bright. In 2005, during a period in which he wasn't deployed, he rekindled his teenage interest in becoming a member of the LAPD and joined the police academy. It's here that problems began to arise. Possibly due to how experienced and trained he'd already been in the Navy, Dorner was described as disrespectful to authority, from minor incidents such as him showing up to a conditioning run in bright neon sneakers, despite being advised against it by his superiors, all the way up to accidentally shooting himself in the hand, which earned him a 2-day suspension in the academy. But in spite of these problems, Chris managed to graduate by 2006 and was sworn in as a probationary officer, although he wasn't able to exercise this position for long, since a few months later, he was once again deployed by the Navy. Once he came back to the LAPD in July of 2007, on his very first day on duty, he told his partner, Teresa, that he was planning to sue the police department as soon as his probationary period ended, supposedly on account of them mishandling complaints he'd made against his classmates in the academy. This mishandling is something he attributed to racial bias against him specifically, although information on the contents of these complaints is scarce, and proof that he was persecuted in any way is even more non-existent. According to Teresa, Christopher repeatedly made mistakes while on the job that could cost him or someone else their life, such as responding to a report of an armed subject by walking into the middle of the street with no cover. It's worth noting that this perception of incompetence wasn't one-sided, as Teresa and Dorner, at least at this point in time, both agreed that he needed to get more training. As a matter of fact, Christopher even cried in the patrol car at one point, demanding additional training. But for reasons that I don't quite understand, the department refused to send him back to the academy. But although they were initially in agreement, Teresa and Christopher soon stopped seeing eye to eye, and it would all come crashing down when responding to a call made about a schizophrenic man with severe dementia who was refusing to leave his hotel room. Once they got there, a struggle between the 2 cops and this schizophrenic man ensued, concluding in Teresa pulling out Dorner's taser and using it on the guy. 2 weeks later, as both officers had already discussed, Teresa filed an evaluation on Chris, noting that he still had a lot of training to do. However, around the same time, Chris actually reported Teresa for use of excessive force, accusing her of having kicked the schizophrenic man in the face twice. Internal Affairs looked into it and spoke to 3 witnesses who saw their scuffle, all of whom claimed there was no instance of excessive force or face kicking whatsoever. The only person who claimed otherwise was the schizophrenic man himself, although he'd also contradicted himself on this matter when speaking to the doctors who were treating him. Most likely, this notion that he'd been kicked to the face was a product of his obviously altered state of mind. But Chris thought otherwise, as this is what led to his termination from the police department for having falsely accused another officer of abuse. Over the course of the next half-decade, Dorner continued to appeal this termination to an almost obsessive extent, never truly getting over it, despite having a perfectly successful career in the Navy outside of his work as a cop. It's around the time of his termination that Chris describes himself as falling into a deep depression of such intensity that he believed that his brain should be preserved after his death and studied by scientists. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like he ever got a proper diagnosis from a real physician. He just decided he was depressed, despite his symptoms not being exactly compatible with that diagnosis. During this time, it doesn't seem like much happened, but there was in fact something deeply paranoid and violent brewing inside of Christopher's mind, and and being honorably discharged from the Navy in 2013 was what finally allowed him to manifest it. Almost immediately after no longer working in the Navy, he wrote a lengthy manifesto in the form of a Facebook post titled Last Resort, in which he claimed that the LAPD had ruined his life and that he'd run out of legal methods of getting his name back. The signs of delusion were pretty clear. He blames the LAPD case with the ending of his career in the Navy, despite there being no correlation between the two, and then goes on to say that they were personally responsible for the breakdown of his relationship with his mom and sister. At this point, it had been 5 years since the incident had taken place, and no one except Chris himself was still thinking about it on a regular basis. Further signs of his mental deterioration show up in the form of a formal declaration of war against the cops, with Christopher writing, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants." This quote is not directed toward the US government, which I fully support 100%. This is toward the LAPD, who cannot monitor itself. I have nothing to lose. My personal casualty means nothing. You cannot prevail against an enemy combatant who has no fear of death. An enemy who embraces death is a lose-lose situation for their enemy combatants. Hopefully, your analysts have done your homework. You are aware that I have always been the top shot, highest score, and expert in rifle qualifications in every unit I've been in. I will bring unconventional and asymmetrical warfare to those in LAPD uniform, whether on or off duty. You will now live the life of the prey. Whatever pre-planned responses you've established for a scenario like me, shelve it. Whatever contingency plan you have, shelve it. Whatever tertiary plan you've created, shelve it. I am a walking exigent circumstance with no off or reset button. Think before you attempt to intervene. You will not survive. Your family will receive that Medal of Valor posthumously. It will gather dust on the fireplace mantle for years. Then one day, it will go in a shoebox with other memories. Your mother will lose a son or daughter. Your significant other will be left alone, but they will find someone else to fill your void in the future and make them just as happy. Your children, if you have them, will call someone else mommy or daddy. Don't be selfish. I am off the grid. I assure you that the casualty rate will be high. Because of that, no one will remember your name. Unfortunately, orphanages will be making a comeback in the 21st century. After this verbal crash out of Navy SEAL copy pasta proportions was delivered, Dorner essentially explained that, besides his hatred for the LAPD, his motivation was gun control. By killing as many people as possible with the weapons he owned, he intended to highlight how dangerous they were and how important it was to disarm every citizen in America. Of course, this was a bit contradictory given his previously sworn allegiance to the US government. His gun ownership is owed not just to the Second Amendment, but also to the fact that he was an active agent of the government through the Navy up until recently. But given he was deranged enough to think that killing innocent people was a justified way to protest against gun control and his termination from the LAPD, I shouldn't really expect a lot of rationality from him. Surprisingly, the most articulate part of his manifesto is when he's describing the details of his planned attacks against the cops, as the rest of it is punctuated by his objections to acts of racism against the then President Obama, despite not voting for him, and pretty much a list of every injustice he thinks people committed against him throughout his entire life, dating back to early childhood. This seems to be a common occurrence in these kinds of attacks. The shooters tend to hold grudges dating back to the time they were in primary school, no matter how small and petty. He also mentions his belief that Hillary Clinton would be a good president, his sadness over the fact that he won't be around to watch The Hangover Part 3, 2 expressions of admiration for actor Charlie Sheen, and 1 for Bill Cosby, who he considered as a model for all black communities to follow. Yeah, this manifesto aged pretty terribly. When he finally put his plans to action, with the expressed intention of killing 40 law enforcement agents, he proceeded to kill 2 people, one of them being the daughter of the officer who defended him in his original case against the LAPD, and the other one being her husband, a security officer who worked for a college. So far, he had done no direct damage to the LAPD, and instead ended the lives of 2 innocent people who were only in the vicinity of an officer who, again, defended him. A few days later, he tried to kill 1 police officer, but only grazed him, and then 20 minutes later, he shot 2 more, and unfortunately one of them did die. This put the LAPD on high alert, and knowing this, Dorner first tried to steal a boat to escape, but once that failed, he set his own car on fire at a nearby trail and left on foot to elude capture. At this point, he'd gotten a $1 million bounty on his head. And finally, while responding to a carjacking report, the police found the stolen vehicle and noticed that the driver was Chris. He proceeded to barricade himself in a cabin in the mountains, from where he would make his last stand against the LAPD. managing to injure 2 cops before the entire building caught on fire, which led to him taking his own life since he couldn't leave it without being immediately shot or arrested. Ironically, while Dorner himself did little damage to the LAPD's reputation, as he was clearly the unhinged and belligerent party of their conflict, it did lead to the LAPD targeting 3 completely innocent people due to their vehicles matching the descriptions of Dorner's, which led to the department paying over $6 million in settlements to the victims, who thankfully did survive the incidents. Randy Stair was born in 1992, the firstborn of a store manager for Wise Supermarkets and a nurse who worked as a biomedical contractor. While he got along with his younger brother, Randy's childhood was marked by loneliness, as he seemed lost and helpless whenever he was left at school by his parents. Eventually, he found one friend by the name of Matt, but even still, Randy remained an outsider, having an easier time befriending his younger brother's classmates, who were all 2 years younger than him, than his own peers. As he grew older, he developed an interest in recording videos, and although they began as simple home videos he recorded for no one's entertainment but his own, he eventually decided to make his hobby public and created a YouTube channel called Pioneers Productions. These home videos quickly gave way to imitations of popular YouTubers from the late 2000s and early 2010s, namely Fred and Make Me Bad 35, the latter of which even collaborated with him on a video and personally befriended him. Additionally, one of Randy's vlogs eventually ended up on the radar of Ray William Johnson.
Alright, a couple of interesting things about this. One, the kid who originally posted this actually vlogs regularly on YouTube, which usually isn't the case for people who post these videos. And good for him, you know? Someone gets hurt in his grandpa's yard and he's like, F it, I'm gonna post this shit on YouTube right next to my blogs.
During this period, it seemed that Randy was on his way to become a minor content creator of some kind if he just kept hacking away at it. But as time went on, it seemed Randy was stuck, as he repeatedly tried to recapture the brief period of popularity that he gained from Make Me Bad 35's collab video. And right as his online presence was stalling and becoming stunted, an acquaintance of Randy's by the name of Tom suddenly passed away in a car accident, which Randy wrote about in his diary. It forever left a depressing void in my heart. I barely spoke to the kid, but I knew him. Everyone knew him. Within a few minutes, I was just numb. I sat there in the parking lot in my green Nissan Altima and was just in complete shock. Not freaking out, just pale, numb, miles away. I hardly knew the kid, but being only a grade ahead of him, it really hit me hard. My brother was a wreck since he was in the same grade as him, knowing him his whole life. He wasn't a history class with me, but that might have been 11th grade. It's a blur. Tom's death sucked the life out of me. I'll never forget it and never truly move on from it. Tom's passing marked the beginning of Randy's obsession with death and generally dark themes. Although despite how much it affected him emotionally, he continued to behave outwardly normal for a while. That is, until just a little while after Tom's death, Randy's aforementioned only close friend, Matt, also died in the same exact way, a car accident. These two events happening in such close succession were what led to what Randy eventually referred to as the 2013 curse, which he blamed for sapping the will to live completely out of him. He wrote about it in his diary. I don't want to work anymore. I don't want to deal with anyone anymore. The 2013 curse is a hell of a strong one. The thing is, I like it. I love it. I love the darkness, the sadness, the abyss, all of it. Sinking into the depths of the dead. It's literally a drug. I won't fight it because it's where I belong. I love that place. I love it. It's at this point that he developed his infamous obsession with the Danny Phantom character Ember McLean, a ghost girl who Randy believed he was destined to embody. While he'd already known of and felt drawn to this character before, it's only now, in the latter half of high school, that his true fascination with her takes a turn for the worse. In his diary, he frequently fantasizes about how much he wanted a girl's body, which he idealized he would obtain by killing one and fusing into them, at which point his physical form would become that of a ghoulish girl. This fixation of his inspired him to start cross-dressing in secret, and it's at this point that his darker interests began leaking onto his online content, as even his sketch videos now contained some very dark themes. By 2014, Randy's mental state had deteriorated to the point where it was affecting his ability to hold a job. After high school, his mom got him a stocking position at the hospital she worked at the time, but he immediately quit, saying he envisioned himself hurting people at his work. He got a few callbacks from other places he'd applied to, but he never answered his phone or replied to emails because he didn't want to work any kind of job. All Randy could bring himself to do was work on his videos, now abandoning his former branding and taking on the name of EGS, short for Ember's Ghost Squad. Whenever he wasn't doing that, he was fantasizing about enslaving humanity after taking his own life and joining the Ghost Squad in the afterlife. Although it's hard to gauge what exactly brought this specific fantasy on, his ideation of taking himself out frequently took on a more aggressive nature, where Randy believed he needed to hurt others or take others' lives before taking his own in order to complete his mission. This aspect of his fantasies manifested with him becoming excessively interested in the Columbine massacre, going as far as to frequent forums about it. In one of his posts to a forum, he wrote, "The biggest question of all, though, is would any of the Harris family forgive Eric? A big question I've always wondered is, if the shooter's families saw their sons in the afterlife, would they forgive them?" Clearly, he still had some semblance of self-awareness, at least that his urge to kill others was something to potentially feel guilty for. At the same time, he sank deeper and deeper into his delusions, and began to see taking the lives of others as a necessary path to achieve his goal of joining the Ghost Squad. However far-fetched and deranged that may sound, this is what he actually believed. Eventually, he began recording a series of YouTube videos, slowly laying out his feelings about his own life and the world. Much like the YouTube videos of Elliot Rodger, Randy did his best to cobble together some kind of cohesive reasoning to the crimes he intended to commit. But ultimately, it was very clear that his ultimate motivation was the result of a psychotic delusion, the delusion being that something good would come out of doing something so horrible. As he imagined his afterlife as a ghost girl allowed him to be famous and young forever, his depression continued to eat away at him, as he struggled to even eat, dropping his weight down to a measly 133 pounds despite standing at around 6'4". Not only did he not know the inner workings of his motivations, he wasn't even sure of what his actual target would be up until his very last days on this earth. While he spent months putting together an animation of himself and his ghost girlfriend Mackenzie targeting a school, he was actually planning to either target his own family members or people at the supermarket he worked at. Eventually, he settled on the store, and after extensive planning, he got one last meal with his mom, and that same night brought a shotgun to his workplace, taking the lives of 3 out of 4 of his co-workers before he turned the gun on himself. His very last act before ending it all was tweeting from the point of view of his own ghost girlfriend, saying he was sorry it had to be like this. While Columbine and other incidents have become way more notorious, few incidents have been as deadly as Seung-Hui Cho's attack on Virginia Tech. Born in South Korea and immigrating to America when he was just 8 years old, Cho always showed signs of developmental issues. The first to be noticed by his peers and his teachers was his inability to speak. Not only did he struggle to begin conversations with others, he ignored whenever someone else attempted to initiate an interaction with him. In one instance, his teacher all but compelled him to speak during class, threatening to fail him if he didn't take part in a reading exercise. Unsurprisingly, due to how little practice he had, when he finally conceded and made an attempt at reading, he did so in a strange, deep voice, which resulted in his classmates laughing at him. This traumatic incident took place half a decade before he went on to commit his crimes, and while it doesn't seem like they're directly correlated in any capacity, his bizarre behavior was already signaling something was terribly off. Despite clearly suffering from developmental issues, Cho did manage to graduate from high school and enroll in the place he'd eventually target, the Virginia Polytechnic Institute, where he chose to major in English. However, transitioning from high school to college did nothing to alter the course he was on, as he continued behaving strangely towards others. At one point, he became known as the question mark kid, due to him drawing a question mark on his sign-in sheet on the first day of literature class. Oddly enough, at around the same time, Allison Heck, a female student of Virginia Tech who went to the same high school as Cho, found a question mark drawn on her door. It's not conclusive whether Cho was indeed the person behind this, and it could just be a coincidence. On the other hand, what is a matter of public record is the fact that in December 2005, Cho was admitted to a psych ward after a roommate of his expressed concerns that he was intent on taking his own life. After speaking with him for about half an hour, the triage counselor who was responsible for overseeing Cho's case wrote on his file saying that he promptly denied any genuine ideation, claiming that what his roommate was concerned about was just a joke and that he had no genuine intention behind it. However, this was only the latest consultation, as in the previous weeks, Cho had spoken to 2 different therapists to whom he reported persisting symptoms of anxiety and depression. Given how socially inept he otherwise was, I doubt that Cho could fool a total of 3 different psychologists into thinking that he was perfectly fine. So for all intents and purposes, it does seem that, at least this time, he was just a psychologically troubled student. The same cannot be said for the person he slowly became, as over the next 2 years, he is described as being removed from one of his classes due to odd behavior and violent, blood-drenched writings. Additionally, he was reported to campus police by 2 different girls who got creepy messages from him, harkening back to Cho potentially stalking and drawing a question mark on a student's door. It's hard to say the exact context and contents of these red flags, but it's undeniable that his dysfunction was becoming increasingly apparent to everyone in his surroundings. Unfortunately, none of these incidents led to Cho being officially deemed a danger to himself or others. Due to a combination of privacy laws and a lack of compatibility between different databases for mental health reporting, his name wasn't in the federal system that's set up to prevent people with this kind of history from getting firearms. Unbeknownst to anyone around him, Cho spent the better part of the year and a half following his extremely brief stint at the psych ward as a ticking time bomb. Although his motivations weren't specifically against or for a certain outcome, what was certain was his urge to hurt others. And in April of 2007, these impulses were acted on.
After getting his hands on 2 handguns and a hunting knife, Cho entered a dorm room and shot 2 of his fellow students dead.
It's completely unknown to this day why these 2 students, or this dorm in specific, was targeted. Cho wasn't even located in that dorm's building and had no relationship, positive or negative, to the first 2 victims. One potential link is Cho having begun college as an engineering student, changing his major to English later on, meaning there could be some kind of grudge he held against other engineering students or the department as a whole. But again, there's nothing definitive about this. After taking the lives of these students, he suspended his rampage and walked all the way back to his dorm. And the interim time was enough that the police arrived to where his victims were, but had no clue that this grim crime was an ongoing active shooter situation. After changing out of his clothes, Cho put together a package, and 2 hours after he killed his first 2 victims, he physically mailed his manifesto to NBC News, along with a cache of pictures. The images, 43 in total, mostly consisted of Cho posing with his weapons menacingly, or just images of the weapons by themselves. Bundled together with these, for reasons unclear, was an image of a blue sky. The metadata, which I'm assuming was either printed out along with the rest of his manifesto, or retrieved later on by investigative journalists, showed that he'd begun writing it just a few days prior to his attacks, and only completed it a few minutes after he'd already taken 2 people's lives. His manifesto itself, totaling a little over 1,800 words, spread over 3 documents and a few recordings, was particularly noteworthy due to how incoherent it was. In it, and the files accompanying it, Cho makes seemingly random references to Al-Qaeda and terrorism, as well as his hatred for his fellow students, calling them trust fund rich kids. Although despite this, it's not at all clear if his financial status or economic beliefs played any role in his crimes. Even his rage is dubious, as he occasionally speaks in an apologetic manner, and whenever he does talk about going through with the attack, he neglects to mention any specific person or particular reason to do it, almost as if he's actively trying not to acknowledge it in order to be able to carry it out. In one of the few released clips from his manifesto, he gives a generic and performative speech about how he was forced to do what he did.
You forced me into a corner and gave me only one option. The decision was yours. Now you have blood on your hands that will never wash off.
While he suggests having issues with religion and bullying, again, none of it adds up to a central motivation, and it all seems more like he's trying to come up with a reason to do it after already having decided on doing it. As almost 3 hours since his first 2 killings took place, Cho walked up to one of the classrooms, once again seemingly a random target, and started firing at the people inside in a thorough manner, ensuring he secured as many kills as possible. Fortunately, he wasn't as thorough as he thought he was, as some students did manage to survive by pretending to be dead, leaping from windows, and taking refuge in locked rooms. Once he was done with one classroom, he walked right into another and continued his rampage unimpeded. Later on, it was discovered that Cho had even chained the doors of the building shut so that no student could escape, and no cop in the area could enter. After killing over 30 students and injuring around 20 more, Cho took his own life right as the police reached the 2nd floor of the building. It's rare for an incident of this kind to be as deprived of an overarching narrative or specific delusion, but in a way, this is one of the most transparent incidents as well. As many reasons as there can be for this kind of thing, the culprit tends to always be a lonely, developmentally stunted, narcissistic sociopath. Cho just happened to be unusually bad at coming up with rationalizations for his impulses, but they were just as frivolous as any other killers. While Timothy McVeigh and Anders Breivik were still by far the deadliest far-right terrorists, neither could hold a candle to just how influential Brenton Tarrant ended up becoming. But very few people know what led up to his act of terrorism. In the late 2000s, Brenton's father was diagnosed with a form of lung cancer caused by asbestos, and by 2010, the disease had progressed to the point of needing palliative care, which led to him taking his own life. This didn't come as a surprise to Brenton, as his father had talked to him beforehand, and the two essentially agreed on it. it. After his father passed away from cancer in 2010, Brenton began traveling the world nonstop, almost as if scratching it off his bucket list, although it's dubious whether he was even considering doing what he eventually did. During his years traveling, he also chronically engaged with online right-wing content since he was 14 years old, and over time, he grew increasingly radical in nature. If you're looking to get an idea of just how radical he was, it's enough to say that the politically incorrect board on 4chan was not enough for him, and he had to go to 8chan, whose infamy skyrocketed after Brenton's crimes. He eventually adopted an ideology called eco-fascism, which combined elements of environmentalism and anti-capitalism with extreme opposition to immigration, to the point where it justified killing foreigners in order to accelerate the progress toward its goal. It's hard to say when exactly this idea became ingrained in his mind, but by 2017, he stopped traveling and went to New Zealand, already well aware of what he was about to do. He obtained a license to carry and purchased multiple firearms legally, although he modified a few of them to make them more lethal, all while occasionally visiting the Al-Noor Mosque, his intended target. While he acted perfectly normal during this period, with him being a part of a rifle club and being described by his former employer as someone who held no extreme views or displayed unusual aggression, it was just a matter of time before Brenton committed one of the most heinous acts of violence in history. After a little over a year spent accumulating an arsenal of weapons and over 7,000 rounds of ammunition, Brenton began his attack. In just under 1 hour, Brenton took the lives of over 50 Muslims and injured another 89, all while live streaming it to Facebook while he played music over a speaker mounted on his body. The entire event was clearly structured in order to attract as much attention as possible, as his weapons were decorated in a variety of different and obscure right-wing messaging. Additionally, right before he began the attack, Brenton published a 74-page manifesto titled The Great Replacement. In it, he delves into his aforementioned ideology, punctuating it with references to memes, in stark contrast to his extremely grim actions. It's fitting that he cited Breivik as one of his inspirations, since the two of them seem to have the same aloof affects toward their crimes. Among the many justifications Terrence attempted to provide for his deeds was the prospect of demographic change in his country, as he specifically focused on crimes committed by Muslim immigrants against white people in a variety of different European countries, some of them even against children. However, he immediately follows this up by using it to justify his targeting of innocent Muslims and even children, describing them as future enemies. Again, much like Breivik, it seemed that however closely tied his claimed beliefs were to his crimes, he ultimately betrayed them. While he stressed the necessity of people to return to religion and have kids to fix the birth rates, he had no kids and expressed no interest in religion himself besides using its symbols and history when convenient. Lastly, he stated he specifically used weapons that were both hotly discussed in gun control debates with the expressed intention of having them banned so that the issues he perceived in his country would accelerate. While his case is unique, as he doesn't seem to be mentally ill or developmentally dysfunctional in any way, his apparent plan of accelerationism is similar to the infamous Manson family's helter-skelter conspiracy, where they intend to commit a series of crimes in order to spur on a race war. Brenton's manifesto, along with the archived version of the Facebook stream of his crimes, spread exceedingly fast online. But by the time they made their way to mainstream news, Brenton had already been run off the road as he drove to the place he would target, where he was then arrested by the police. When his case was taken to court, he happily pled guilty to all of the charges against him, and infamously did the OK sign with his hands as court photographers covered his trial. Even after being faced with multiple life sentences for the things he'd done, he expressed no remorse whatsoever. Unfortunately, outside of his many victims, Brenton's plan did succeed in yet another way: the creation of copycats. In his manifesto, he laid out a basic set of propositions to incentivize as many people as possible who felt like him to go out and do the same thing, and it's grim to find out just how many people actually did. One of the most notorious of his copycats was Patrick Crusius, whose face you probably recognize from the now universally used Chud Jack. In August 2019, just a few months after Brenton's attack, Patrick took the lives of 23 people and injured 23 more. Much like Brenton, he too posted a manifesto right before he did it, this one named The Inconvenient Truth. In it, he spoke of the same things as Brenton did, although there was visibly a lot less effort and forethought behind it, as it was only 4 pages long and contained only a fraction of the articulation. Instead of targeting Muslims, Patrick targeted Mexicans, and while Brenton had a thought-out ideology, Patrick had vague notions of what his actions would lead to. After pleading guilty to 90 federal charges and getting 90 consecutive life sentences, Patrick currently faces the prospect of being sent to death row, as prosecutors are looking to give him the death penalty. Besides Patrick, there was also a man by the name of John Earnest, who targeted a synagogue in California just 1 month after Brenton's attacks, succeeding in killing 1 person and injuring another 3. Unlike the previous previous men's manifestos, who were cold and clinical even when attempting to be sarcastic, John Ernest's manifesto is titled An Open Letter, and it's a lot closer to the Columbine diaries than a proper manifesto. During a little under 6 pages, John fluctuates between pretentious religious extremism and an overuse of 4chan lingo, to the point where it reads like a parody or a bad work of fiction. All of this makes it even darker, that someone as clearly underdeveloped and immature as the then 19-year-old John Ernest was moved to take someone's life. Ultimately, his deeds landed him in prison for life without parole, with an additional 137 years. In October 2019, yet another person who was already deeply caught in extreme right-wing ideology was called forth to action by Brenton's attack. 27-year-old Stephen Ballier, a former soldier of the German armed forces who decided to use his familiarity with weapons for evil. Like Ernest, he targeted a synagogue during a Jewish holiday, leaving behind only a manifesto, which, while light in articulation, was even more egregious in its structure, as it laid out his plans as if it were a video game. He had so-called objectives, like proving the viability of improvised weapons, and achievements that differed based on what weapon he used and what kind of victim he used it on, which, unlike every other Terrence copycat, seemed to include Christians along with the other groups Ballier considered undesirable. Despite his experience in the German army, Stefan was one of the least successful copycats, as he failed to even enter the synagogue, proceeding to shoot repeatedly at its door and even setting off a homemade explosive to try and blow it open, all of which failed. During this blunder, he was streaming to Twitch and trying to reiterate his manifesto as well as he could, although very little could be understood due to his inability to speak English. As his explosives malfunctioned, a female passerby gave him an odd look, and in response, Stephen shot her on the spot, also accidentally shooting out his own car's tire in the process. After this, he went to a nearby Turkish kebab shop where he began randomly firing until he killed someone, claiming the life of a painter. At this point, the police had been alerted, and after briefly exchanging some fire with Stephen and injuring him, they succeeded at arresting him. It's worth noting that neither of the people whom Stephen killed were Jewish or in his categories of people who deserve to be targeted. He only managed to kill fellow Germans, absolutely failing on every dimension of his plans. Sadly, the same cannot be said for Tobias Rathjen, who was also German but quite different from Stephen. Although he echoed many of the talking points of Terrence's Great Replacement, Tobias fits much more neatly into the category of, well, a complete schizo. His manifesto, although it's not that long, contains many references to his belief that many American intelligence agencies have been surveilling him, and that Donald Trump himself was not only overseeing his activities, but actively taking inspiration from them and even occasionally plagiarizing Tobias's words, stealing his slogans. In his manifesto, he also outright claims that he's been guided by voices in his head for his entire life, and that his mental problems, along with the government gang-stalking him, made it so that he could never be with a woman. And in the middle of his manifesto, this guy randomly starts talking about how the rules of soccer should change. I should note that Tobias never names Brenton Tarrant as his inspiration or anything to that effect, but given the close proximity of their crimes, it's not unlikely that Tobias was part of the wave of copycats. Whatever his mental situation was, he eventually adopted the belief that the only path forward for him was to target migrants. And in February 2020, he went to 2 bars where immigrants congregated and took the lives of 9 people, before going back to his house and doing the same thing to his mother and then himself. While Tobias was barely hanging on to the category of Terrence copycat, Peyton Gendron was as close to a Terrence sycophant as one could get, with a large amount of his manifesto being directly plagiarized from Brenton's. Another sign of his lack of real identity is that in the autobiographical sections of it, he mentions being a staunch communist during his teenage years, only to do a complete 180 as he became an adult, with the catalyst of it being Brenton's crimes and livestream. As much as he tries to mimic Brenton in every way, down to the writing style and formatting, he's clearly a lot less ingrained into this worldview and ideology than Brenton was. At times, it's almost as if he's actively trying to impress the reader while trying to string together as many impactful one-liners as he could. Interestingly enough, his real manifesto that he posted, which he very much wanted everyone to see, is kind of less important than another diary he had, which he wrote on Discord. In it, he regrets staying inside as much as he did in his youth, wishing instead that he went out with his friends and enjoyed his life, going as far as to say that if he could go back in time, he'd make it so that he never got on 4chan and embarked on this path. Numerous times in his diary, he expressed an interest in taking his own life instead of committing his attack. In one especially disturbing entry, he mentions once chasing and killing a cat in his neighborhood. It also turns out that years before, back in 2020, he was placed in a psychiatric facility for making threats against his school. But clearly he didn't get the help he needed because his violent and self-destructive urges continued to fester. Much like his peers, he live-streamed his attack, which targeted
targeted the parking lot of a supermarket in a predominantly black area near where he lived. During the few minutes he was able to act out his crime, he shot 13 people, 10 of whom died. Eventually, he pled guilty and was charged as an adult, resulting in a total of 11 life sentences without parole, with an extra 90 years on top of that. Gendron is pretty unique in that, unlike all of the other copycats, he himself was also copied by another killer, a man from Slovakia with a name that I'm about to butcher brutally, but I'm gonna try anyway, Juraj Krajcik, the son of a far-right politician who referred to Peyton as Saint Gendron, and later went on to kill 2 people outside of a gay bar. Similar to Gendron's intensive imitation of Brenton, another killer by the name of Nathaniel Veltman wrote a document titled A White Awakening, which contained identical excerpts of Tarrant's original manifesto. His crime, which was running over an entire family of Muslims, was hardly planned and seemed pretty spontaneous, as while he was wearing a full military getup with a helmet and a bulletproof vest, he had no guns on him whatsoever. His manifesto wasn't even properly released, and instead it had to be discovered by law enforcement agents long after the crime had already been committed. This wasn't some effort on Nathaniel's part to keep his motivations concealed either, as he was open and even energetic about what he had done, pleading guilty to all of his charges and ensuring everyone knew what his motivations were during the court proceedings. Strangely enough, prior to the attack, he spent 4 years working at an egg processing plant where some of the other employees were Muslim. Yet, he was always described as an easygoing regular person at work. But there is one pretty interesting story about his time at work. One of his coworkers said that the day before the attack, Nathaniel had told him that he took a lot of mushrooms the night prior and that he saw Satan. Although it took a long time for the court proceedings to finish up, in February 2024, he got hit with 5 life sentences, one for each of his victims, including the one he didn't actually manage to kill. While most of the copycats range anywhere from 18 to being in their late 20s, there was one person who fell out of that distribution, a 15-year-old Swedish boy named Hugo Jackson, who, in the lead up to his attack, spent 2 years regularly inhaling perfume, which is not good for you. During those 2 years, he went from having a healthy social life and doing well in school to being arrested for shoplifting with a friend, becoming obsessed with far-right themes, fist-fighting with his father, occasionally leaving his house without telling anyone where he was going, and a lot of other concerning things of that sort. Although it's hard to tell due to uncertain reporting, it's very likely that Hugo, who is referred to as Axel in the original Swedish news articles, was directly groomed and pushed to doing increasingly violent and radical things by people online, particularly on Discord. As per the reporting, only one other person, an Italian guy, knew about Hugo's plans and was attempting to dissuade him, but unfortunately it was to no avail. In mid-2021, Hugo finished putting together a makeshift manifesto and planned to attack his school, the name of which has been kept out of circulation, along with the stream of the incident taking place. As bad as it was, Hugo only managed to stab and injure one person before the cops arrived. After a brief exchange where he was asking the police to kill him, he laid down and let them arrest him. Oddly enough, as Hugo's background and online activities were investigated, they found he was in regular communication with another Swedish teenager with whom he played Roblox, and the two essentially goaded each other into becoming more and more radical over time. In a dark turn of events, just a few months later, this other kid also committed his own attack on his school. But again, he only managed to injure a couple people. It was also discovered that Hugo was of Colombian and Sri Lankan descent, and judging by the nature of his online activity, this seems less like a case of a cold-blooded terrorist and more like mentally ill teenagers, mostly doing it for attention, with their political ideology only serving as a minor backdrop. Due to the laws in Sweden, both Hugo and his friend got just a few years in a youth detention center, and honestly, we can only hope they're on some kind of watch list, so they're never able to reoffend in a similar fashion. After 3 straight years of multiple copycat killers popping up left and right, they significantly died down by 2022, only to resurface in 2023, with an American by the name of Ryan Paulmeter. Much like Peyton Gendron, he chose to target random black people near a general store in Florida, specifically citing not only Brenton, but also Anders Breivik and Timothy McVeigh in his writings as his inspiration. In his manifesto, titled White Boy Summer to Remember, he rattles off the usual spiel, punctuating it with non sequiturs, like a list of things that led him to commit his crimes, which included things like high rent prices in Maine and the end of the Burger King 2 for $5 chicken sandwich and cheeseburger deal. I'm not kidding. He actually wrote this. Before going to the general general store to commit his acts of terrorism, he messaged his dad and told him to check his computer. Once his dad got to it and figured out his son had gone out to do something terrible, he called 911 and informed them that Ryan had previously threatened to take his own life and was currently receiving psychiatric care. Unfortunately, by the time 911 caught wind of the situation, Ryan had already taken the lives of 3 people and proceeded to take his own life to avoid capture. There were a few interesting aspects to his manifesto, such as him seemingly being self-aware of how pathetic he was, acknowledging the fact that he was overweight, and also him admitting to having no cohesive ideology on how to actually make the world better. Another unique element of Ryan's document is the inclusion of references to not 4chan, but instead Soyjak Party, a website that was created after the QA board on 4chan was closed. And much like 4chan, while it's mostly composed of harmless people with an unusual sense of humor, it does seem to attract its fair share of miscreants. It's worth noting that Ryan himself recognized how difficult it would be to carry out his actions, even while believing the things that he believed in, which led him to recommend and take what he called an extreme drug cocktail, composed of what he refers to as diet speed and Valium to calm his nerves. Oddly, unlike many of his cohorts who use their writings to be transparent, Ryan never lets up the front and makes no mention of his psychological issues, only ever tangentially acknowledging it when talking about an infamous case of a guy who took his own life and how he identified with him. Lastly, he kept with Brenton and all the other copycats tradition of naming random innocent YouTubers in his manifesto. All of this brings me to the last and most recent offspring of Brenton Terrence, Solomon Henderson. In January 2025, 17-year-old Solomon fired up a stream on Kick and proceeded to enter his school cafeteria, firing 10 shots, killing 1 student and injuring another one before Solomon turned the gun on himself. As you could see from his picture, this attack was quite unorthodox in the fact that the shooter was black. But despite this didn't prevent him from fully embracing the same ideology of his predecessors. In his manifesto, the killer expressed being ashamed of his race, saying, "As someone wanting to be normal and fit in, black people hate me, brown people hate me, women hate me, even /Pole hates me to an extent, and I just want to cry in a corner in my bedroom, knowing this is happening and it influences my people that have a terrible influence on my childhood and school life, ruining it for the sake of pushing an agenda and keeping black people with themselves." Ironically, despite being the only black member of the Brenton Tarrant Copycats, Solomon's manifesto is one of, if not the most articulate after Brenton's, which makes sense given he was described as being at the top of his class. Additionally, unlike Ryan Palmeter's manifesto, which only contained indirect nods at the aforementioned Soyjak Party, Solomon's referenced it much more directly, which attracted mainstream media scrutiny to it the same way Brenton did to 8chan. I should note, however, that in the same document, he claims that the website is a shadow of its former self, suggesting that at the point of his attack, he'd moved away from it. Also, in keeping with the tradition, Solomon credited several random content creators for radicalizing him, including iDubbbz, Hassan Piker, Ruben Sim, and, unfortunately, me. As far as what his motivations were, he makes it clear that conventional ideology is something he cares little for, even if the general theme of hating black people is maintained throughout the entire document. Besides that, Solomon's fascination seems to be exclusively focused on the acts of domestic terrorism themselves, and how they can reshape society and destabilize it, regardless of the specific intention of the perpetrators, including himself. Interestingly enough, it was later revealed by investigators that 2 of Solomon's Twitter accounts were being followed by Natalie Rupnow, a teenage girl who just a month prior to Solomon's attack committed the same crime, injuring 6 students and taking the lives of 2 others before taking her own. While she also seems to have had a manifesto, it was more of a goodbye note and contained little, if any, ideological material. Lastly, a third guy by the name of Damian Allen was also tied to Natalie and was preparing for a similar attack, but fortunately he was caught before he could carry it out. It's depressing how common these incidents can be, and it's dark how little motivation it takes for the majority of these people to do what they do. These people aren't on a mission they feel the absolute need to carry out to achieve some grand goal. Instead, most of them simply don't value human life, both other people's and their own, and that makes it so that even internet meme ideologies are good enough of a reason to destroy the lives of multiple people. While it's become a bit of a cliche for shooters to be victims of things like trauma and bullying, the reality is that a lot of these criminals lived perfectly fine lives, with decent relationships with family and friends. Given some of them are genuinely mentally ill, but many of them are no more psychologically troubled than your average person. The only thing that really sets these people apart is the fact that they see little to no significance in life, and this alone gives them the green light to do all of the atrocious things that they did. That's why, in many of these instances, the people they target and manage to hurt aren't even relevant to their belief systems, just collateral damage of their omnidestructive worldview. Mohammed Saeed Alshamrani, a 21-year-old second lieutenant in the Royal Saudi Air Force, arrived in the United States of America in August 2017 for military training at a naval air station in Pensacola, Florida. Alshamrani had grown up in Al-Asa in Saudi Arabia, and by 2015, he had begun following hardline jihadist ideology, making initial contact with the AQAP, meaning Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. His radicalization was well underway before he even began his military training and continued doing it, as he maintained encrypted communications with the AQAP so that his superiors wouldn't find out. He passed US and Saudi vetting and began English language and aviation training at NAS Pensacola, seamlessly blending in with the other trainees, who were none the wiser to his ulterior motives for being there. In July 2019, Mohammed legally bought a firearm and several extended magazines using a Florida hunting license, and from there he began actively surveying a building on his base, called Building 663. He would record videos of exits, hallways, and routines of personnel, which he would save on his phone while speaking to his AQAP correspondents to plan his attack. After roughly a year of preparation, on the evening of December 5th, 2019, Mohammed hosted a dinner party for 3 fellow Saudi trainees, during which he played videos of mass shootings and discussed his grievances against America. Unfortunately, the other students did not report the incident to US authorities, the explanation for which being that they thought he was just very opinionated on the topic. Later that week, however, a Twitter account believed to be his retweeted the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and followed it up with a set of screenshots with written text, which read, "I'm not against you for just being American. I don't hate you because of your freedoms. I'm against evil, and America as a whole has turned into a nation of evil. What benefit is it to the American people to suffer for the sake of supporting Israel? Do you expect to transgress against others and yet be spared retribution? You will not be safe until we live it as reality in Palestine and American troops get out of our lands." Just a few hours after making these posts, in the early morning of December 6, 2019, Alshamrani entered Building 633 at NAS Pensacola with his weapon and 6 magazines. He began his attack by shooting at framed photographs of US presidents before proceeding to shoot at trainees and instructors, all the while shouting anti-American slogans at whoever was in his path of destruction. After about 15 minutes, he managed to injure 8 people and kill 3, at which point police officers arrived at the scene and intervened. In what was probably some kind of attempt to preserve the encrypted communications with the AQAP, Mohammed reacted by shooting his 2 iPhones, although it ultimately proved fruitless, and the FBI was later able to recover and unlock the devices. But going back to the day of the incident, after shooting his iPhones, he attempted to exchange fire with the cops and the base security officers, and was then immediately neutralized. Long after his death, the AQAP publicly took credit for his attack and published his last will, which was directed at his family and spoke about his hopes that Allah accepted him as a martyr for the cause of jihad. This marks the first successful and thoroughly planned terrorist attack confirmed to have come from this group since 9/11, and there may have been some intentional connections to the attack on the Twin Towers. For example, on the 11th of September in 2019, Mohammed tweeted that the countdown had started and visited the 9/11 memorial. Honestly, given that his Twitter account had always been public, it's surprising that no one picked up on this earlier, as he followed and retweeted several Islamic clerics that were considered extreme even by Saudi Arabia standards, expressing outright support of jihad while remaining vague on what exactly that would entail. This wasn't even something he only did right before he committed his attack either, as he was active on this Twitter account for a whole 2 years prior to what happened. Lastly, he publicly praised a man by the name of Anwar al-Awlaki, a man who has been cited as a key factor leading to the Boston Marathon bombings in 2013, the Charlie Hebdo attack, the San Bernardino shootings, and the Orlando nightclub massacre. It's worth noting, however, that none of those were confirmed to be the work of Al-Qaeda, usually being led by forces allied to another group, the ISIL, or ISIL, whereas the scrutiny surrounding potential recruits of terrorist organizations was clearly too lax prior to Mohammed's attack. After it, the scrutiny became excessive, as 21 trainees were expelled just on the fact that they were Saudi, and the entire foreign military training program was suspended until further review. It's kind of difficult to believe that this kind of thing is still going on to this day, since for the majority of people around my age, 9/11 and the following conflicts surrounding the Middle East kind of feel like a thing of the past. Unfortunately, they're clearly not, as there are still people being roped into killing random, innocent American citizens over the country's foreign policy. Again, guys like Mohammed and the Islamic clerics he admired aren't even recognized or respected by the leadership of Saudi Arabia itself, with many of them having been punished and disavowed for their extremism. Likewise, Mohammed's acts came as a shock to his family, who had no idea of his plans and motivations. As to them, he seemed pretty normal prior to the attack. Hopefully, as more time goes on, this kind of incident becomes increasingly uncommon. Ethan Blair Miller was a 20-year-old resident of Bend, Oregon, and had a history of aggressive behavior, although it wasn't overt in nature. For example, former classmates of his described him as a loner who was interested in MMA and got into a few fistfights at his high school, even threatening to shoot someone after a fight at one point. However, it doesn't seem like these incidents ever escalated into something greater. That is, until August 2022, when Ethan suddenly went into the Safeway grocery store in the Forum Shopping Center, carrying with him 3 high-powered firearms, 3 Molotovs, a tactical vest, and a satchel full of ammo. A lot of his activity was caught on CCTV, which showed that he first fired a few rounds into his own vehicle before going after other people's, and finally entered the Safeway, where he went on a spree. At about 7 p.m., Ethan walked into the store and began going from aisle to aisle, shooting at anyone he saw, successfully claiming the lives of 2 elderly men, one of whom succeeded in disarming him temporarily using a produce knife before Ethan managed to kill him. Perhaps demoralized by his injuries, with the police entering the store and having been disarmed by an old guy, Ethan immediately sat against a produce display and took himself out. Due to the complete lack of cohesive targeting, for a time, no one had any idea what the motive behind his crimes were. But eventually, it came out that Ethan maintained a journal on the website Wattpad titled The Downward Spiral of Ethan Miller. In it, he first speaks about COVID, his opinion on it being that despite the fact it was real and a dangerous situation in his estimation, it was used by governments to isolate people, which he claims led to his inability to get jobs, find love, or get back into MMA. According to Ethan, the combination of these factors led him to commit his acts of violence. But it becomes immediately clear that there are more things at play than a mere stir-crazy guy who went psychotic. A few pages into his diary, he writes, "Honestly, I hate humanity. They're not even good people anymore. They have turned into robots, programmed into a schedule with beliefs of God and doing things the right way. Honestly, religion is a myth perpetuated by greed and used as a form of control, but I won't get into all of that just yet. Maybe this simulation theory is real, and to get out, you must die. I'm not exactly human anymore. I have a human body, but I've evolved a step above you human I have self-awareness. I know I'm not meant for this world anymore. I'm not meant to be stuck here. I need something greater, and I will unleash my wrath on the human race on my way out, and it'll be godlike." Though it should be pretty easy to pick up on due to him directly paraphrasing their diaries, it's clear that he's purposely channeling the Columbine killers down to the phrases he uses and the concepts he alludes to. Unsurprisingly, just a few paragraphs later, he directly refers to them and admits that they're his main inspiration, as well as including entire sections just to put lyrics from KMFDM songs, specifically the ones known to be the main fixations of Eric Harris. While Ethan does eventually delve into topics relating to his personal life and his upbringing, all it really reveals is that his family isn't that unusual. According to him, there was some drama and arguing, but very little beyond what plenty of people experience without having to kill others for sport. Another strange highlight of his manifesto is the occasional mention that he'll have to go to the next life to find his soulmate, which honestly sounds a lot like Randy Stair's spiel about ghost girls, and is a complete break from the otherwise pure Columbine mimicry that Ethan spends the rest of his manifesto engaging in. There are other times when Ethan directly alludes to having his heart broken, which led him to be in this current predicament, but there aren't enough details to really go off of. Honestly, it's hard for me to even go over a lot of the contents of this document, because whenever he isn't going into detail about how much he wants to kill people, he's going into detail about how much he craves being with a woman. Between his claims that he is God and the entire verses of Nine Inch Nails songs he lines his diary with, he does make some justice to his claims of being self-aware when he writes the following: "I'm evil, plain and simple. That is literally the only answer here. My head doesn't work right. It never really has. No one caused this but me, and me alone. Don't go blaming my family or friends. Don't go blaming Trent Reznor or any other artist I listen to. Don't blame guns and don't ban them. I was going to hurt humans in one way or another. I want to get a couple things straight though. First, I am not a white supremacist. I hate everyone and everything. I hate them all. Secondly, I am not an incel. I don't ever want to be associated with those losers. I simply know what I want isn't achievable here. I don't have anything specifically against women, although most women are fake and shallow. Incels are not me. Third and last, I reiterate, I am the only person responsible. No one else is to blame. I am evil. I absolve everyone besides myself of any guilt." As the days went by, his entries only got more and more aggressive, going as far as to say he was aiming to take the lives of at least 40 people when the time of his personal doomsday came around. However, at the same time, he himself clearly wanted to die, almost as much as he wanted to hurt others. In one of the last pages, he writes, "Peace. The man has found peace. He's ready to move on to his new life with her. He sees her. She's perfect. Like she was made for him, as he is for her. The man has come to terms and is ready to be with her now and to move on to his new life. It's hard to say what degree his personal writings were performative due to how downright infantile they were in tone for the most part. It's almost as if he lacked the ability to even gauge the gravity of the things he was talking about. Half of it read like something straight out of Johnny the Homicidal Maniac, to the point where I'm honestly surprised he didn't directly reference it at some point, given how much he liked Nine Inch Nails and KMFDM, and those things have quite the shared audience. Fortunately, as we now know, Ethan didn't come anywhere near his intended number of victims, although it's still tragic that he took the lives of 2 innocents the day of his attack. Christopher Harper Mercer was a man in his late 20s living with his mother in Winchester, Oregon, although he lived the majority of his life in Southern California. Information on his past is spotty, although we do know that he attempted to join the Army in late 2008, but flunked out of basic training and was discharged for it. Soon after, he's listed as having graduated from a special needs school, which he attended due to having been diagnosed with Asperger's. Despite this, he didn't act out in any particularly noticeable way prior to his attack, with his neighbors describing him as odd and anxious at worst. Mostly, he just kept to himself and stayed inside, only ever exhibiting any signs of aggression when arguing with his mom, who described him as consistently angry throughout his life, going as far as to point a shotgun at her at one point over an undisclosed issue the two had. However, she couldn't bring herself to call the cops on him for it, as she feared what would happen to a person like him if he ended up in jail. According to her, he tried psychiatric medication for a while, but the side effects were too much for him to handle, thus allowing his anger to grow unabated. Eventually, this anger began manifesting outwardly, not with people in real life, but instead online. On a torrent website of all places, an account tied to Christopher's email made a comment on a news story of an ex-employee who shot 2 journalists, saying, "I have noticed that so many people like him are all alone and unknown. Yet, when they spill a little blood, the whole world knows who they are. His face splashed across every screen, his name across the lips of every person on the planet, all in the course of one day. Seems the more people you kill, the more you're in the limelight." There was clearly some kind of developing dysfunction festering underneath the surface. While Christopher still seemed to make an attempt at living a regular life, attending college, and even maintaining a profile on a dating website, he was fascinated by military history and had an obsession with guns, accumulating a total of 14 firearms leading up to his attack. It doesn't seem like he made much of an effort to keep these two sort of disparate aspects of his identity separate, as on the same MySpace page where he posted pictures of himself in a tuxedo at his sister's wedding, he also posted expressions of his admiration for the Irish Republican Army, of all things. If you're not familiar with the IRA, it's a paramilitary group that strongly opposes the government of the United Kingdom. Despite these strange behaviors of Christopher's being posted publicly, no one in his surroundings could even consider they'd escalate to the point that they did. Suddenly, on the 1st of October of 2015, Christopher drove to the Umpqua Community College campus with 6 of his firearms and body armor, and began walking to the classroom in which he took writing classes. When he got to the hallway, he fired a warning shot to get people moving, and then began his attack, only stopping to spare one of the students so that he could hand him a package to deliver to the police. After this student was selected as his emissary, he continued his rampage, targeting people in particularly cruel and unusual ways. He made one of his victims climb back onto her wheelchair before he took her life, and asked a few other people what religion they were before killing them. Oddly enough, the answer seemed to be completely irrelevant to him, as he shot them all anyway. But when one of the students said they were Catholic, he briefly stopped to say, "Thank you for standing for your beliefs," right before he killed them. Ultimately, he injured 8 people and killed 9 others before he took his own life when the cops arrived. And for the next few hours, no one had any idea as to why he did what he had done. That is, until the student he spared delivered the package. When opened, it revealed a flash drive that contained his writings. Some of it was relatively standard by, well, insane person Manifesto standards. It kind of echoed Columbine and Elliot Rodger. "I have always been the most hated person in the world. My whole life has been one lonely enterprise, one loss after another. And here I am, 26, with no friends, no job, no girlfriend, a virgin. I long ago realized that society likes to deny people like me these things. Just like me, those people were denied everything they deserved, everything they wanted." But things quickly took a turn for the weird, going in a direction that I don't think a single shooter so far has gone. Immediately after expressing his allegiance to shooters who came before him, Christopher wrote, "I have been forced to align myself with demonic forces. I now serve the demonic hierarchy. When I die, I will become one of them, a demon, and I will return to kill again and again. For people like me, there is another world, a darker world that welcomes us. For people like us, that's all we have left. My success in hell is assured. They will give me the power that I seek. They have always been there, speaking to me on the sidelines, controlling me. It's only fit that I join them after death. They've told me what to do, showed me the way. This pivot takes place right in the first page of his manifesto, and just a few paragraphs later, he once again pivots away from it in a way that would be funny were it not completely psychotic and also tied to someone who did what he did. I was once like you, a loser, rejected by society. When the girls would rather go with alpha thug black men, we can all agree that something's wrong with the world. When good individuals like myself are alone, but wicked black men get the loot, like some sort of vaginal pirate. It's not fair. The black man is the most vile creature on the planet. He is a beast beyond measure. But don't take these words to be racist. I don't hate blacks, just the men. It's good that he notified us that he's not racist. That's very reassuring, and I believe him. I was going to take this moment to raise the point that Christopher himself was of mixed race, but he immediately addressed this in text, saying, "Now, of course, some of you will be saying, wait, you're 40% black, aren't you? Ah, yes, dear reader, I am. But thankfully, my partial blackness didn't come from a man. If it had, my brain would be fried. It is the black male who is foolish. Black women are not to blame. They are hapless dupes to the black man's conniving machinations. Africa would be better off without the black man. They should be executed, and the black queen should take over Africa." Elliot Rodger was right when he said his thoughts on the black male. I fully agree with him. All they care about is sex and swag. It would be better if all black women left the beast on the altar and dated a white man, or lesbian exploration. But due to the black murder rate, in 100 years there won't be any black men. They will all be in jail or dead. The number of ebony lesbians will increase. Joy, joy, joy. After concluding this insane rant, he goes on to inform the reader of his favorite movies and musical artists, followed by a diagram of what he thinks a good black person looks like and what a bad black person looks like. Right before the end of the document, he says Elliot Rodger is a god and dedicates his actions to Satan. Like most of his cohorts, it doesn't seem like Christopher could fully grasp reality, and his untreated psychological conditions led him to outright delusions of being possessed by demons and communing with them. This kind of delusion among killers like Mercer has become a lot more uncommon since the whole concept of demons and religious phenomena has severely lost popularity in favor of more ideological motivations. However, if you just set that aside, Mercer is as close to Elliot Rodger copycat as one could possibly get, and it was clearly by design. It's hard to believe that someone can legitimately look up to someone like Elliot and attempt to reenact them, but unfortunately, that is the case with Christopher. Dylann Roof, a 21-year-old from Columbia, South Carolina, carried out one of the most vile, racially motivated shootings ever at a Methodist church in Charleston. Roof, who had a history of social isolation and increasing online radicalization, entered the church during a Wednesday night Bible study and sat with the group for nearly an hour before opening fire, killing 9 and wounding a 10th before fleeing the scene. Due to the kind of clearly propagandic pictures he took, as well as his belongings, any superficial investigation of Dylann's stuff or online presence could easily lead the detectives on his case to conclude that his attack was racially motivated. Between the Confederate flags, the visible firearms, the occasional allusions to Rhodesia or apartheid-era South Africa, it was very clear. But ultimately, the cops didn't have to rely on their deductions, because the next morning after he committed the attack and fled the scene, he was caught and interrogated, at which point he made it abundantly clear why he did what he did. Oddly enough, despite his almost careless admission of his crimes and motivations, he actually said he felt bad and expressed total disbelief when he found out how many people he'd actually killed, having estimated the number to be lower than it actually was. However transparent he was with the cops during interrogation, the full extent of his beliefs were only revealed a few days after the attack, when the authorities discovered his website, The Last Rhodesian, which contained his manifesto. In it, he claims his upbringing and environment was not racist at all, as he grew up alongside many African American people due to the area he lived in. It took the Trayvon Martin case happening for Dylann to start concerning himself with racial politics, leading him to look into black-on-white crime statistics and having his entire worldview change overnight. After this introduction and backstory, he expounds on his reasoning for the dislike of black people, but ultimately, he only expressed a fraction of disdain for other of the common targets of right-wing extremists. For example, he considered Jews to be fully white and didn't seem anti-Semitic, and also suggested that some aspects of Hispanic culture were even more admirable than that of white people, even if he ultimately compelled himself to see them as his enemy. Lastly, he reserved a special kind of contempt for American patriotism, saying he hated the sight of the American flag and resented veterans for thinking they were owed something for having taken part in wars. Dylann's document is unique in that it offers almost no insight into his personality outside of his ideological views, and it comes to an abrupt end right as he runs out of ethnic groups to summarize. He concludes his short manifesto saying, "I have no choice. I am not in the position to, alone, go into the ghetto and fight. I chose Charleston because it is the most historic city in my state, and at one time had the highest ratio of blacks to whites in the country. We have no one doing anything but talking on the internet. Well, someone has to have the bravery to take it to the real world, and I guess that has to be me." It's ironic he says someone has to have the bravery to do it right after admitting he wouldn't succeed if he went directly to a black neighborhood, opting instead to target a church where he can trust the people will be unarmed and not capable of fighting back. While his manifesto offered little in the way of information about his background, some facts about him eventually surfaced as cops spoke to people who knew him. For example, he exhibited some signs of OCD and was obsessed with always having his hair cut in the exact same way, which is a habit that lasted from early childhood up until the time he committed his attack. Additionally, he failed the 9th grade twice, spent a lot of time on his computer, smoked weed since he was 13 years old, and over the years, progressed to using harder substances like Xanax and oxycodone, to the point where he had to undergo an outpatient treatment. As far as previous run-ins with the law, however, Dylann's criminal record was short and underwhelming, as he had a record for trespassing and illegally possessing Suboxone, but nothing outside of that really signaled any propensity towards aggression. Despite noticing Dylann slowly becoming more of a recluse over time, his family and his neighbors could hardly sense just how deep of a rabbit hole he was falling into until it was too late. Unbeknownst to them, Dylann was a regular visitor of a variety of extremist websites, and although I'll note right now that this could just be something his lawyers claimed to mount an insanity defense, it's possible that Dylann was suffering from undiagnosed schizophrenia and autism. Of course, none of this justifies or exonerates him for what he did, and even if he doesn't believe he should be punished for it, to some extent, Dylann agrees that whatever conditions he may or may not have weren't a factor for his decision to attack the church. As he eventually wrote, "Anything you heard from my lawyers in the last phase, I ask you to forget it. I would like to make it crystal clear. I do not regret what I did. I am not sorry. I have not shed a tear for the innocent people I killed." He actually struggled against his own lawyers for years to try and prevent them from depicting him as someone with mental illness, saying he would rather die than use an autism defense because it would ruin him and make everybody think he was a weirdo. Mind you, this isn't because he disagreed with the diagnoses. He actually seemed to agree with them. He just didn't want to use it as a defense. The judges were more than willing to comply, as the state of South Carolina sentenced him to 9 consecutive life sentences with no parole with an additional 95 years, and the federal government then sentenced him to death. Eventually, of the 40 people who were on federal death row, 37 of them were pardoned by Joe Biden, with Dylann being one of the only 3 who weren't, along with the Boston Marathon bomber, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, and the Tree of Life synagogue shooter, Robert Bowers. In late March of 2023, a 28-year-old former student of the Covenant School in Nashville, Tennessee, Audrey Elizabeth Hale, made a sudden return to her school in full tactical gear, packing 3 firearms. Over the course of just a few minutes, Audrey went through over 150 rounds and took the lives of 6 people, 3 of them being 9-year-old children. Thankfully, the school was well trained in responding to this kind of event, so they locked down quickly and prevented Audrey from entering the majority of the classrooms, causing her to shoot through the doors blindly. Within 15 minutes of the teachers having called 911, the police had not only already arrived and breached the location, but also shot Hale down with no hesitation. As the investigation ensued, detectives quickly discovered a few messages Audrey had sent to her former basketball teammate from middle school, announcing that she'd be dead that day and her death would be covered by the news. Once her identity was established, the police searched Audrey's home and bedroom, finding her artwork, custom clothes, and her personal writings, which were distributed through a variety of different media formats, but mainly consisted in a couple of thumb drives. They also discovered Audrey had a degree in graphic design, no criminal record whatsoever, identified as a lesbian, and signaled online that she was considering undergoing gender transition, taking on the new name of Aiden Williams, although no actual transition ever happened. Among her writings, officers found that Audrey had written a thorough account of her childhood experiences, suggesting that she was particularly fixated with that time period of her life. It's hard to say why exactly, since it doesn't seem a particular event took place that led to her fixation, but regardless, it was the first step toward understanding why she targeted the school she used to attend when she was a kid. Besides these notebooks, she kept scrapbooks containing a multitude of drawings she made and pictures, all of which had been neatly maintained and preserved for years, further suggesting her unhealthy attachment to her distant past. Eventually, the cops got to her electronic devices, which is when a clearer picture of her motives began to appear. While her documents were not immediately released in full, the police made a synopsis of their contents. She always struggled with mental health conditions, with a strong suspect that she was on the autism spectrum. But despite her developmental problems, she described herself as having the happiest years of her life at the Covenant School, the same one she eventually targeted. But it all came crashing down once middle school ended and high school began, as the social support network she'd worked herself into all but disintegrated, and with this disintegration came the full-fledged return of her mental struggles. Growing concerned, her mother had her go to therapy, which got her diagnosed with a laundry list of conditions, but curiously, not autism, which was frustrating to both her and her mother, who strongly felt she did indeed have it. Right around this same time, her relationship with her dad grew strained as he retired and became a bit of a recluse. Though her developmental issues were being addressed, after high school ended and her mother made her attend college, Audrey resigned herself from anything resembling a healthy lifestyle, causing her weight to drop to unhealthy levels, leading her to see another therapist about it. This therapist, in turn, told her to start journaling, which she took to extremely well, but it had one bizarre side effect. She began to hate. First, she hated her father for retiring and lowering her family's financial standing, and then, slowly but surely, her contempt grew outward in a variety of different ways. She wrote about her occasional homicidal ideations toward her father and claimed to have attempted to take herself out a few times, but only in ways that would leave no physical trace so that her mom and therapist would never find out about it. She also began chronically shoplifting as a form of self-medication for her anxiety. Eventually, she got around to the root of her negative emotions, which was the feeling that she simply didn't belong. While this feeling was first centered around the fact that she was in a predominantly black area and she felt ostracized and excluded by black culture for her ethnicity and mental conditions, over time it narrowed down to her former middle school classmates and the feeling they had abandoned her. She began cyberstalking every single one of them, growing resentful and envious that they went on to live successful, happy lives, and she didn't. It's at this point that her ideations were directed away from her father and instead toward her school. And this fascination didn't take long to become outright admiration, as she aspired to become like them. Finally, she concluded that the only way she could regain the attention she wasn't getting from her former friends who abandoned her was by killing a bunch of children. That's literally what she said. It's particularly grim to discover that in 2019, these plans of hers were nearly foiled as she slipped up and expressed to her therapist that she'd been having these ideations, which led him to recommend her to take part in an outpatient program. Unfortunately, however, after she completed the outpatient program, her therapist retired and she had to start her process with another person. Although the program was seemingly effective initially, as she expressed less negativity overall, she quickly fell back into her old ways, describing herself being sucked into a dark abyss of rage and despair. Just like that, she was once again on track to, in her own words, make herself a god like the Columbine killers. Partly due to her OCD, it took about 2 years to fully settle on what exactly her crime should be. For example, she was considering targeting another school, but was worried that, due to its mostly black student body, she'd be branded as a racist by the media. Over the course of these 2 years, she occasionally was either caught or accidentally said something that tipped her therapist or her mom off to her ultimate intentions. And in one instance, it even got her firearms seized by her parents, which only served to make her more mad at them. Unfortunately, she eventually got them back, and although she briefly considered not doing it when she had some prospects of a job relating to her degree in graphic design, when those prospects fell apart, it sealed her fate. While her documents were never officially designated a manifesto by the police, leaks eventually revealed that Hale's writings were more political than initially suggested. In some excerpts, she wrote about how much she wanted to kill white children, referring to them by homophobic and racial slurs. At another, she specified she wanted to destroy her own race, saying, "Being white sucks, but being black is so cool. Black people should rule. White people should fall. Every white person who lived and died, I hate you all." The leak of these excerpts, much like the shooting itself, came out of left field for Audrey's family and acquaintances. As far as they could see, Audrey was the kind of person who would make children's books for a living, as she constantly made positive and colorful artwork. Long after her crime had faded into obscurity, the contents of her diary were finally released in full. Although it starts with what looks to be just budgeted expenses, the second and third page already mention the firearms with which she was planning to carry out her attack. From the 5th through the 18th, she lists out all the media she intends to consume before her passing, followed by a mapping out of her targets. The actual diary-like entries only start by the 22nd page, and from that point onwards, the majority of the pages pages are decked out with bizarre, hideous drawings and disorganized text scribbled all over the place. After complaining about having been scammed for a few pages, we get to Audrey lamenting her own existence and identity, right next to the words, "No brown girls, no love. I am nothing. Brown love is the most beautiful kind." This is the overture for a sequence of extremely creepy, stalkerish rants, all of which seem to be dedicated to the same girl who's probably the former basketball teammate she texted right before her attack, although it's possible it's someone else. Notably, there are a lot of redacted sections, some of which look like they're people's names or maps of locations, but others don't really look like either, and it's hard to imagine why they've been redacted. The homophobic slurs from the leaks are not only confirmed, but also elaborated on. As in a page, she writes, "Lesbians can be cute as long as they are feminine. Kill all the bitch lesbians and all the girly boys. Let all the black police hang us." In another section, Audrey laments her virginity, adding that she resorts to cartoon not safe for work material and having her stuffed animals engage in intercourse. Beyond her virginity and lack of a girlfriend, which she explained exists in her head as she could feel it and dream about it. Although this portion of her writings is mostly focused on her relationships, it eventually doubles back to focus on her planned killing. After remarking that she wants to make the Columbine killers proud, she spends a few pages detailing her hatred for her dad, Christianity, and her specific focus on taking the lives of their children as a means to act out her hatred. Besides Christianity, the leaks that claimed she specifically targeted white children were also confirmed. On top of the segments of these documents that confirm the leaks, there are a few other interesting parts, some of which were reported on, some of which weren't. For example, it was widely covered that one of the events that pushed Audrey to her obsession with death was the passing of another girl she was friends with during middle school, Sydney. According to mutual acquaintances, she admired her, and in her diary, when talking about the date she was planning to carry out the attack, she focused on the number 17. Although part of it seems to be a reference to the X album of the same name, the number 17 is broken down in a diagram into 13 and 27, which Audrey draws hearts around and captions it with "My girls." 27 is pretty easy to figure out as it was the age Sydney was when she died, but 13 is a bit of an odd mystery. It's not the age of any of her victims, as the kids she targeted were all 9 years old. Maybe it could be the age in which Audrey herself was still happy and unaffected by her later conditions, but it could also be someone else entirely, whose name may be among the innumerable redacted parts of these documents. Ultimately, Audrey herself strips any pretense away from what she did, as near the end of her documents, she wrote, "I have to kill so I can be remembered in the most horrific way possible. That way, no one will ever forget. The end." Regardless of whatever deeper issues and tragedies that took place in her personal life, you can't really come up with a more succinct explanation of any of these crimes. Alex Hribal grew up in Murraysville, Pennsylvania, the younger of two sons in a family described by friends, neighbors, and his own attorney as stable and supportive. His parents, Harold and Tina Hribal, were active in his life and maintained a close relationship with both of their sons, often taking part in school and community activities. Tina described Alex as sweet and quiet, an opinion which was shared by the people who knew him at school. Not only was he seemingly a nice guy, he also consistently did well at school, averaging B and B+ grades. The worst it got as far as people's description of him was a vague feeling that there could be some disturbing aspect of his personality that they never got to see. Indeed, no one got to see it, as up until 2014, Alex never acted out in a way that targeted other people. However, since elementary school, Alex was described by his doctors as struggling with depression, having considered taking his own life around the 5th grade. But regardless of how serious and concerning that is, it's unfortunately common today for young people to experience that kind of thing, and it's hardly evidence someone is going to turn into an unhinged killer. For a brief period in junior high, these feelings did subside, but as high school progressed, they slowly came back, and Alex became increasingly isolated. While there were some conflicting reports on this issue, it doesn't seem like he was the target of any significant amount of bullying or social exclusion. More so, it seems that Alex chose to isolate himself and spend his days on his computer, where he exposed himself to things that distorted his worldview. While his family was none the wiser to what was going on, police eventually found that on the lead up to his attack, he made 2 phone calls to fellow high school students where he threatened their lives. Oddly, neither of these students were actually targeted by his attack, which makes the situation even more confusing. With seemingly no buildup, on the morning of April 9th, 2014, just after 7:00 a.m., Hribal armed himself with 2 kitchen knives and entered his school's first-floor science hallway, where he proceeded to stab and slash other students, managing to injure over 21 people in the process, although fortunately, no one lost their lives. Unlike many attackers, who took the opportunity of the attack to yell out at their victims crimes, Alex was described as completely emotionless and silent. After Alex managed to scare off all the students in the hallway, in order to get more of them out of their classrooms, he pulled the fire alarm. But before he could continue his rampage, he was tackled by the assistant principal and handcuffed by the school resource officer, who subdued him until the cops arrived. Despite being captured, he refused to let go of his knives, saying he had more people to kill and his work was not done. Due to his demeanor, the immediate suspicion was that he was the target of bullying. But once the investigators got to rummaging through his belongings, they found his manifesto, a 4-page letter explaining the reasons for his attack. In it, he credited the Columbine attackers for inspiring him and supposedly showing him how to achieve freedom in heaven, and referred to them, along with some other historical figures, as gods. While the title of the document was Ragnarok, he doesn't seem to make any references or allusions to the Norse concept of the end of the world, which means he probably just picked it as the title because he thought it was a cool word. The philosophy he does explicitly espouse, however, is nihilism, the belief that morality is a human construct but doesn't exist tangibly. After establishing that this was his main motive, he pivots to what made him come to that conclusion, saying that attending public school dehumanized him. According to him, all he saw during his time there was other students pursuing drugs, alcohol, sex, and money, which made his opinion of the human race plummet to the point where he had to do what he did. Before he ended this document, he wrote, "And here's to the only essay or paper I've ever enjoyed writing and reading over and over. That also makes this a holy book, written by a prophet who would become a god when he died." After the police arrested him, Alex was described as looking like a deer in headlights, and when his case got to trial, 3 different psychiatrists began working with him and diagnosed him with major depressive disorder and schizotypal personality, describing him as psychotic and paranoid. Though he was responding to treatment and showing improvement when he took to medication, he wasn't allowed to plead insanity and was sentenced to 23.5 to 60 years in prison for his attack. During his trial, he expressed remorse for his actions, but didn't seem to fret much about his sentence, while other people suggested he should be permanently placed in a mental hospital, not a prison. Whatever the case, it's unfortunate that he was only diagnosed and treated for his issues after he had already committed his crimes. Regardless of how it should reflect on his sentence, his untreated mental issues definitely contributed to his actions, meaning it's possible there could have been some chance to prevent it altogether. While the crushing majority of these crimes are committed by young people, with very few being older than 30, there are some exceptions. One of them is 58-year-old Jim David Adkisson, who was born in 1950 in Illinois and served as a private in the U.S. Army for 3 years. After being discharged, Jim lived a normal life. He took up work as a truck driver and had a son. But as the 2000s rolled by, Adkisson's life all but fell apart. He fell out of touch with his now adult son, and eventually he also lost his job. Now living in isolation in a small apartment, his neighbors described him as a quiet, solitary man who rarely interacted with others. But while his neighbors had no idea of what kind of guy Jim was, his ex-wife Liza and the people whom she told knew the truth. Over the course of 10 years, Jim gave himself over to hard drinking and substance abuse, which led him to threaten his wife multiple times, leading to their divorce. Additionally, he was described as constantly consuming far-right media to the point that it was an essential aspect of his life. There wasn't one moment where he wasn't exposing himself to doomsayers on the radio, which pushed him further and further into isolation as his contempt for the world around him grew. Although he wasn't really extreme in some ways, as he still identified as a Republican and not some obscure meme ideology, he was extreme in others, as his devotion to his cause was such that he eventually began believing that the only way to solve the world's problems was to take violent action against those whom he saw as the destroyers of his country. The divorce itself was hardly the sole reason for the attack, as Jim had already gone through 4 other divorces prior to his divorce with Liza. But whether it was the substance abuse or his inability to find employment after losing his job as a truck driver, at some point he completely lost touch with reality. As he lived completely alone and didn't have anyone visiting him, he began preparing for his attack. In June 2008, he bought a shotgun from a pawn shop, and a month later, he stowed it away in a guitar case as he went to the Knoxville Unitarian Universalist Church, which was not only well known to be a church that promoted liberal ideals, but also happened to be the church he knew his ex-wife attended. What's even more concerning is that Jim went there right as there were 25 children performing a theater play, although it was later deduced he avoided shooting at them, targeting the adults exclusively. Although it's almost hard to believe, he only managed to fire 3 shots off before he was subdued by people in the church, but this was enough to kill 2 people and injure 7 others. When the cops arrived and arrested him, he immediately began explaining his reasoning for the crime, claiming that he targeted the church for its liberal teachings, claiming that they were directly responsible responsible for tying America's hands in the War on Terror. While speaking to the officers, he also revealed that he had written a letter, as he didn't expect to still be alive after his attack. Once they searched his home, they found this letter, which was really his manifesto, where he clearly establishes that this was, indeed, a hate crime, and one he did with full intention. The majority of the manifesto is just reiteration of the things he'd already said to the cops. In his conclusion, Jim wrote, "No one gets out of this world alive, so I've chosen to skip the bad years of poverty. I know my life is going downhill fast from here. The future looks bleak. I am tired of being sick and tired. I'm absolutely fed up. So I thought I'd do something good for this country. Tell the cop that killed me that I said, thanks, I needed that. If you would, take my sorry carcass to the body farm, or donate it to science, or just throw me in the Tennessee River. Sincerely, Jim David Adkisson." It's interesting to see that despite being over a decade early to this kind of attack, Adkisson rattles off the same exact kind of rationale, trying to weaponize people who feel their life is meaningless into domestic terrorists. A few months after his attack, Jim refused to put together an insanity defense or stall the trial in any way, happily pleading guilty and being sentenced to life without parole. Born to a Russian middle-class family in 1982, Dmitry Vinogradov was described as a socially awkward person, with a strong preference for activities that he could do alone. Whenever he wasn't reading or playing video games, he was browsing online forums. His less than stellar social capabilities were the result of a rather traumatic childhood. Dmitry was severely oxygen-starved as a newborn, and as a result, he suffers from numerous neurological issues, including anxiety, depression, and autism. As if that wasn't enough already, he has been tormented by chronic headaches ever since receiving a brain injury while out for a walk at age 4. Although, despite the challenges he faced, he actually managed to earn himself a law degree from a respected university in Moscow. Eventually, he was hired as a legal advisor at Hribal, one of Russia's largest pharmaceutical distributors, which is a more than decent position for someone in his field. His co-workers described him as considerate and polite, although it doesn't seem he was super close to any of them. While he was still an aloof oddball who only really interacted with others when he needed to due to his work, he never presented a threat to his coworkers or showed any form of aggression. But this changed in early 2012, when Dmitry entered into a romantic relationship with a female colleague of his at Hribal. After planning and paying for a trip with this girl, she suddenly broke up with him and informed him that she wouldn't be going, which sent him into a deep depression. As he recovered from this incident, or tried to anyway, Dmitry bought a rifle and began to practice shooting at firing ranges. His mother, who was still close to him at this point, noticed that his depression had severely worsened, but at this point in time, he still didn't do anything to suggest he was considering hurting anyone. But unbeknownst to anyone, Dmitry spent the following 10 months carefully planning his attack on Hribal, until in November 2012, almost a year after his ex-girlfriend broke up with him, and long after anyone expected it to still be affecting him, he mysteriously went on a 5-day drinking binge. This was strange for Dmitry, who didn't usually do this kind of thing. On the 6th day, when he finally sobered up, he came back to the Hribal office, but this time, lugging an unusually oversized backpack. Although people were so confident that Dmitry was a good guy that they just assumed it was nothing of note. Unfortunately, after sitting down at his desk, he armed himself with 2 weapons and began his rampage, taking the lives of 6 people and injuring another. Among his victims was his ex-girlfriend, who was deliberately targeted by him. Eventually, one of his guns ran out of ammo, and one of his co-workers seized the opportunity to subdue him, and in doing so, he saved not only his own life, but also the lives of everyone else who was still in the office. Eventually, the security guards and police officers arrived to take Dmitry in, which put a real wrench in his plans of dying while exchanging fire with the cops. After he'd attacked and been arrested, it was discovered that the night before, he had scheduled his manifesto to go up on his VK page. For those who don't know, VK is essentially Russian Facebook. While the original manifesto doesn't seem to be available anymore, a translated transcript of it exists, although it's not worth getting into because it's your run-of-the-mill misanthropy and humanity is cancer type spiel. It read like an attempt at coming up with a reason besides him being mad that his ex broke up with him. And after his attack, he pretty much admitted to this, saying, "I went to the office where my ex-girlfriend worked, said, 'Hello, colleagues,' and began shooting right in front of her eyes. I wanted her to see that I'm cool, and then I wanted to shoot myself." While he later apologized for what he did that day, of course, it held no sway in his sentencing, as he was placed in a maximum security prison, which he will hopefully be staying in for the rest of his life. Adding to the short but highly deadly list of Scandinavian terrorists is 18-year-old Pekka Erik Auvinen. While his father was a musician and his mother was active in green politics, Erik seemingly didn't inherit any of the positive outlook or personal investment in social activities. In fact, he was always resigned to his own world, described as a bullied outcast with interests in fringe topics. The reason for this drastically different demeanor was eventually deduced to be his mental health issues. In late 2006, his parents sought him psychiatric help, but due to his symptoms being perceived as mild, he was simply prescribed antidepressants with no follow-up therapy. He initially went along with it, taking his medication somewhat infrequently, but a few months later, he stopped taking it altogether. It's also around this point that the first signs of aggression were displayed by Erik, as he's described as making threats to other students and suggesting that they would die as the result of a white revolution. While he did engage with some content related to far-right movements and things of that sort, it didn't seem like Erik embraced any one extreme ideology, instead cherry-picking certain elements from the ones he liked best. He often took part in discussions about events like the Columbine Massacre and the Waco Siege, and posted nearly 90 videos revolving around this kind of topic, some of them featuring songs from KMFDM. Again, a good band, but also a band whose music is known to be popular among people who are obsessed with Columbine. Shortly after beginning his attack, Auvinen uploaded a file package to the internet containing 21 files, including pictures of himself, his firearm, and his high school, as well as 3 documents written in Finnish and English. The most important document was his Natural Selectors Manifesto, a 5-page document elucidating his doctrine, which, although it clearly expressed support for concepts related to eugenics and opposed things like equality and political correctness, at the same time it fervently supported atheism, psychology, existentialism, and other things that didn't allow him to be neatly placed among the many other right-wing terrorists. As a matter of fact, a good chunk of the manifesto spoke out against totalitarianism, but for whatever reason, in Erik's eyes, the only possible way out of what he warned would be the end of humanity, would be, well, the end of humanity. He first argues that ideally, the world should be ran by an absolute aristocracy, where a minority of intelligent individuals enslave the majority of stupid individuals. And, of course, he considered himself to be one of the smart ones. However, at the same time, he expresses skepticism at this possibility, and then goes on to suggest that the only final solution is to eliminate all human beings. While Erik does reference many different concepts related to existentialism and philosophy, it doesn't seem like he has a sufficient enough understanding of them to really go deep, and he just kind of name drops them to make himself seem smart. Unfortunately, Erik's public announcement of the massacre he was about to carry out wasn't discovered early enough, and around noon on November 7th, a date deliberately chosen for being the 70th anniversary of the October Revolution, he entered his high school with a semi-automatic handgun and proceeded to take the lives of 8 people and injured another 13 before taking his own life. One of the most strange cases is the one of Robert Flores, a 41-year-old Gulf War veteran and nursing student who, in late October 2002, entered his university's College of Nursing building and fatally shot 3 professors before taking his own life. Due to how obscure and old this case is, little is known about the perpetrator's life prior to his attack outside of the things I just mentioned. But in compensation, his manifesto is one of the most interestingly structured. Titled Communication from the Dead, he opens his document by saying, "Greetings from the dead. You have received this letter after a rather horrendous event. To be perfectly honest with you, I do not know what forces are compelling me to write this." As he continues writing the document, he claims he's estranged from his 2 siblings and that he was raised by a police officer father who, although not outright abusive in any meaningful sense of the word, was consistently distant, as if he was always uncomfortable around his own children. His mother, on the other hand, he described as a classic enabler with low self-esteem, suggesting she tolerated pretty much anything from her children. After giving an unusually detailed and lucid description of his family's constitution, he notes that he spent several weeks without making any additions to his document. When he comes back, he shifts his focus to documenting his experience in the army, with an emphasis on a case in which he, along with many other soldiers, experienced debilitating pain, headaches, nausea, and diarrhea, which he claims was due to them being downwind from where engineers recklessly detonated munitions that contained nerve gas. After this, he skips ahead on the timeline on to cover his struggles after coming back from the army, as he worked odd jobs to support his family while at the same time studying to become a nurse, resulting in him regularly staying up for 2 or even 3 days in a row. Despite being academically successful and well on his way to graduate, right as he was going on to his 3rd year of study, his wife threatened to divorce him if they didn't move to Texas, which brought his goals of becoming a professional nurse to a screeching halt. According to Robert's retelling, despite going along with her requests, she ended up suddenly divorcing him anyway after a few months, taking the majority of their belongings with her and claiming he was abusive to her in court. 1 month after she left, Robert was hit by a car and developed intense back pain that never fully went away. But even with all of these major problems mounting, he continued to do everything in his power to study and try to become a professional nurse. And it's at this point that he begins taking issue with his instructors. Even with semester after semester of him taking loans out to pay his college enormous volumes of money, according to him, they continued to sneer at him and act like they didn't owe him anything in return, doing as little as they could to train him properly. Eventually, Robert got fed up with it, writing, "I am 41 years old and have come to the conclusion that I deserve and demand respect. I am a human being and I have worth. I have decided that I will stand up for myself and I will be assertive." What I discovered was that being a male and non-traditional student, and shudder, assertive, was not compatible with the instructors at the College of Nursing. While the college does maintain a small minority student body, it is primarily white women from upper middle class backgrounds between the ages of 20 and 25. The college promotes and desires diversity, but they only want their approved diversity and no other. In many ways, male nursing students are tokens. He goes on to list out examples of the disrespect he suffered at the hands of his instructors, claiming they outright ignored him when he raised his hand, and when he objected to their treatment of him, they gaslit him, acting like they had no idea what he was talking about. He was eventually called on by the head of the school and basically threatened with being expelled if he continued to bother his teachers. But regardless, this issue continued to stew until it boiled over, with a certain Miss Rogers showing him 4 statements alleged to be from hospital staff, claiming he was disrespectful to them and to the patients, although without specifying what the instances of disrespect actually were. Robert also noted that they were unsigned, which irritated him even more. Soon after, he walked into yet another situation with one of his instructors and describes in painstaking detail how he was poorly instructed and then falsely accused of doing things like sleeping during his training. Once again, he was threatened with expulsion, and when he explained how catastrophic it would be for him to not be allowed to continue studying, as he wouldn't be able to work to pay off his student loans debt and his child support, the staff member he was talking to by the name of Miss Monroe answered, "It doesn't matter." In the face of all of these circumstances, somehow, Robert continued to score well on his tests, and whenever he got to actually work as a nurse during his training, he was always described as a good nurse. Coincidentally, right as he was reaching his limit, he randomly walked into someone shoplifting and assaulting a security guard and promptly helped subdue the man until the cops arrived. Although it's not exact what effect this had on his mindset, it gave him the feeling he could do something about his situation. In the last few pages of his manifesto, he wrote, "I work as an agency nurse and I have worked most of the hospitals in town and some outside the Tucson area. I genuinely care for my patients and work very hard caring for them. I am told that I am a wonderful nurse who is self-directed. I know what one future brings me. My jobs for my agency have slowed down. I cannot make my rent this month. I am behind my phone, utilities, auto insurance, and child support. I don't drink or have vacations. I have friends, but between work and school, I never have had time to socialize. I am tired and weary. Rather than spend the next month or two selling what little I have, I'm going to end it now. The College of Nursing has burned all caring for my being. I find no joy in the future. Even food seems to hold nothing for me. My body is betraying me. I have prostate problems, but cannot do anything about it as I have no insurance. Another filling has fallen out, and I cannot afford to replace it. I am rational. I understand that I have committed homicide and that I have broken the laws of our society. I will save the taxpayers' money and take care of the problem. I realize that I am depressed, but even with treatment, it will not change my future. People will want to know why I did this. Why the innocent lives? I've been thinking about this for a while. To the psychiatrist, it's not about my unresolved childhood issues. It is not about my anger, because I don't feel anything right now. I have had guns for a long time, and it was my trade in the military. I do not have gun magazines. A waiting period or owner registration would not have stopped me. I have a concealed carry permit, but I have never brought a gun to the university until now. I was a Boy Scout. I crossed the street at the crosswalk. It is not about revenge, as I've always thought that revenge was a waste of time and energy. I guess what it is about is that it is a reckoning, a settling of accounts. The university is filled with too many people who are filled with hubris. They feel untouchable. Students are not given respect nor regard. It's unfortunate, but the only force that seems to get any attention from the university is economic force. I will be gone, but the same same will happen here. The instructors will make statements to the effect that I was unbalanced. I informed them that I was not sleeping, well, gaining weight, had little energy, difficulty concentrating, and feeling sad. These are all hallmark pearls of depression. One instructor asked why I didn't go to the student health center. I replied that it cost money and I would get kicked out of the program if I was candid. The worse they make me out to be, the more ammunition they will give to litigants. So, do I have any regrets? I regret that my ex-wife has estranged my children from me. She has moved them 19 times in 6 years. I regret leaving my dog Bridget. She has been the only thing that has ever given me unconditional love. I regret that there are such people in the world that push a person to contemplate and carry out such an act. I regret leaving those people behind who trusted me and will feel betrayed by this act. As the curtain closes, I will exit the stage for a well-deserved rest. Respectfully, Robert S. Flores. While Robert's manifesto tells a Joker-like story of a guy being continuously taken advantage of and disrespected until he finally broke, it's important to note that after his attack and subsequent passing, some people did describe him as belligerent and disrespectful during classes. On the other hand, someone else who knew him for the previous 3 years described him as polite and normal, just as he'd always been, whether in class or out. But regardless of what the exact details were, what Robert did was obviously unjustified. During his attack, he asked Miss McGaffick, one of the teachers, but not one that he named in his document, if she was ready to meet her maker. McGaffick, being a chaplain at one of the hospitals she worked with, simply replied yes, and Robert proceeded to take her life. Unlike McGaffick, the two other victims whose lives he took were named in the manifesto as people, so it's unknown why she was also targeted. The police arrived quickly, but their intervention was only nominally necessary as he instantly turned the gun on himself. However tragic his life story may have been, the way that he chose his life to end did nothing to enact justice, and simply resulted in more loss of life. In by far the most recent of these cases, on May 17, 2025, a 25-year-old man known as Guy Edward Bartkus drove a car up to a pro-life fertility clinic and detonated it. While the clinic itself was wrecked, his attack only succeeded in injuring 4 people and taking his own life in the process. Given the rarity of this kind of attack, especially in the region of Palm Springs, California, this case immediately ballooned into notoriety, and it just happens to be that this was the attacker's intention. As the case was investigated and the FBI identified Guy, they immediately found his website, where he provided a download link for the recorded stream of his attack on the clinic right at the header of the page. Reports say that a tripod and a camera were indeed found at the crime scene, but I can't tell if he succeeded in streaming to it or if his plan failed completely. After this, Guy immediately goes into an FAQ section, where he describes himself as a pro-mortalist, someone who thinks that dying as soon as possible, and in the most painless way possible, is what all humans should strive for, and that the act of conceiving a child and making new life is something unthinkably immoral and downright evil. He writes, "The end goal is for the truth to win, and once it does, we can finally begin the process of sterilizing this planet of the disease of life. I think we need a war against pro-lifers." Immediately after, he follows up with a mention of other philosophies pro-mortalism is related to: negative utilitarianism, ethylism, abolitionist veganism. Basically, philosophies that have realized religion is but that there is objective value in the universe, and it lies in the harm being experienced by sentient beings. But I just want to say, your God definitely doesn't exist. But if he did, I'd choose Satan over your evil God. Did you ever think that maybe the Bible is just slander against Satan, and that Satan just realized what a creep your God is? Lastly, he gives a brief account of what pushed him over the edge. His best friend Sophie, who took her own life, by getting a guy she was living with to shoot her in the head while she slept. According to him, she was the person he related to the most, as they were both anti-sex, hated men, were vegan, anti-natalist, and the cherry on top, they both had been diagnosed with BPD, although he puts disorder in quotes here. I'm assuming because he thinks it's not a disorder and it's actually good. His website closes off with him linking this girl's social media accounts and a series of subreddits he frequented, which are recommended to the reader. Oh, and I think it's worth mentioning he has Adam Lanza's video transcripts down there as well, in which Adam, the guy who shot up Sandy Hook, expounds on antinatalism. Due to how caricatural these people's ideology is, with terms like radfem, vegan, and misandrist literally strewn across their Tumblr pages, if you're at all familiar with them, it's easy to kind of perceive it as a purely online phenomenon that could never manifest in real life. Unfortunately, we're reminded of the quite real consequences of this line of thinking. The girl Guy mentioned is Sophie Tinney Washington, and indeed, she did get her roommate to shoot her while she slept. Soon after the attack happened, Reddit banned the ethylism subreddit due to to it being credited in the bomber's manifesto. As dark and tragic as all of this is, I can't help but find it ironic that, in trying to kill other people, he only managed to take himself out. Here's to hoping this kind of thing doesn't also become a trend.